Hey guys, tonight we're diving into a part of history that's, well, a little steamy and a lot disturbing. We're peeling back the lacy, soot-streaked curtain on the strange link between sex and witchcraft in medieval Europe. A time when just being a little too attractive or a little too independent might have gotten you accused of consorting with Satan. Yeah, you probably won't survive this. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, tell me where you're watching from and at what time it is. I love knowing who's lying in bed across the world, half awake and hearing this madness through sleepy ears. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing in a dim, candlelit room. It smells like smoke, rosemary and sweat. Outside, a harsh wind howls across the cobblestone streets, rattling wooden shutters as the townsfolk whisper behind closed doors. You hear footsteps echoing across the cold chapel floor as a priest raises his voice to deliver a sermon, not of love or grace, but of fear. The devil, he warns, walks among you. And more terrifying still, she might be your neighbour, or the girl you kissed last summer in the orchard. Maybe she sold you herbs for your cough or wore her hair loose in public. Lust, he says, is a devil's trick. And women? Well, they're his favourite tools. Welcome to late medieval Europe, where sexuality and witchcraft are tangled in a grim dance, and everyone's got their eye on the most dangerous people in town, women who don't behave. Here's the thing, Europe wasn't always like this. Back in the day, before Christianity became the continent's spiritual megachurch, sex and fertility had sacred connotations. Ancient traditions honoured goddesses of love, healing, and yes, even erotic pleasure. But once the church took over the narrative, things got a lot stricter. Suddenly, sexuality wasn't divine anymore. It was dangerous, dirty, a threat to your eternal soul. And that threat, it had a face, a female one. The medieval image of a witch wasn't always just an old crone with a wart and a broomstick. Early on, especially around the 15th century when the witch hunts kicked into high gear, witches were often imagined as dangerously beautiful, seductive, mysterious, women who knew things, like how to make men fall in love, or how to cure a fever, or how to have an orgasm, which, let's be honest, was probably already suspicious in a time when women weren't even supposed to enjoy sex. What makes this even weirder is that the most lurid, explicit descriptions of witches and their sexual habits came not from rumours among the townspeople, but from the people in charge, monks, bishops and theologians. They were the ones writing the manuals, preaching the sermons, and, oddly enough, spending an awful lot of time imagining just how exactly a witch might seduce a man or have intimate relations with the devil himself. Like, in detail. Pages and pages of it. One infamous text, which we'll get into more later, lovingly outlines how witches supposedly kissed the devil's behind, participated in orgies, and cast spells using bodily fluids. It's so graphic you almost forget these guys were supposed to be celibate. But the deeper truth is this. Much of the witch craze wasn't about magic. It was about sex, specifically controlling it. And even more specifically, controlling women who had any power over it. Imagine you're a woman in this world. You're not allowed to speak up in church. You can't vote. You don't get to choose your husband, your body. It belongs to God, your father, or your husband. And if you step out of line, too bold, too educated, too sensual, too old to bear children, too young and unmarried, too widowed and wealthy, then suddenly your neighbours start looking at you sideways. She has a cat, she bathes too often, she dances in the woods, she must be up to something. That's where the paranoia starts to bubble. Women, especially those outside traditional roles, became the target of collective fear. And since sin was seen as a slippery slope that started with desire, any woman associated with that desire, whether as a temptress, midwife or healer, could be cast as a witch. Historical records from the period show us that these fears weren't just abstract. There were real cases where women were accused specifically because of sexual behaviour, or even just being desired. There's the story of Elsa Young, the first person executed for witchcraft in colonial America, whose only crime might have been looking a little too good for her age. Or consider that some confessions, often extracted through torture, described witches having sex with demons who appeared as black men, or being forced into perverse rituals involving unnatural acts. The irony, of course, is that the people interrogating these women were the ones inventing the scenarios to begin with. But the scariest part of all this isn't just the accusations, it's the way sex became evidence. Did your cow stop giving milk after you turned down a man's advances? Witch. Did someone have a wet dream and blame you for it? Witch. Did your ex-husband's new wife fall ill after he left you? Definitely witch. Desire, especially male desire, was dangerous, but rather than blaming men for feeling it, society chose to blame the women who inspired it. Here's a quirky little historical tidbit to really drive that point home. In some towns, it was believed that a woman could curse a man simply by looking at him lustfully, or worse, by causing him to have an erection without touching him. That's right, your natural hormonal response was apparently evidence of black magic. That's a heck of a defence, isn't it? It wasn't me, Your Honour. Her eyes did it. Of course, not everyone bought into this logic. There were skeptics, even in the church. Some scholars argued that belief in witches was itself a form of heresy. Others pointed out that most confessions were made under torture and should be dismissed. But those voices were often drowned out by the roar of moral panic and by the lurid fascination of imagining women as both irresistible and evil. So tonight we begin our journey not with a bubbling cauldron or a pointed hat, but with a whisper in the dark, a look, a touch, a rumour, and suddenly a woman goes from being a lover to a witch. You wake up to the tolling of iron bells, dull and heavy meant to summon souls, not soothe them. The morning is mist thick and sour with chimney smoke. In a village not far from yours, a young woman has been taken in the night. No one speaks her name aloud, but everyone knows what she's been accused of. Not thievery, not murder, something worse. She tempted someone, perhaps by accident, perhaps by being too pretty, too mouthy, too comfortable in her skin. Either way, she's gone now, and the silence hangs over the town like fog. You step carefully across muddy cobblestones, feeling how suspicion clings to everything here, like the damp in your boots or the soot on your sleeve. And as you walk, you remember what they said in church last Sunday. Chastity is not just a virtue, it's a shield against evil. It keeps the devil out. But if you drop it, if you stumble, slip, sin, he doesn't just find you, he enters you, through your mind, your mouth, your body, and suddenly it's not just your soul at risk, it's the whole town. This belief wasn't a fringe opinion. In medieval Europe, the Christian church had become the most powerful institution in existence, dictating laws, morality, even your bedtime stories. And sexuality? That was their favourite target. The human body, especially the female one, was seen as a site of temptation, a battlefield where virtue and vice duked it out like cage fighters in a candlelit cell. And guess what? Vice always had better outfits. The church taught that sex, even in marriage, was at best a regrettable necessity. Something you had to do to make babies, not to feel good. Desire itself was viewed as fallen, broken, a consequence of original sin. And who caused original sin? According to every sermon carved into memory, it was Eve, the first woman, the first to be tricked, the first to tempt. Her legacy wasn't just one of disobedience, it was seduction, and that seed of blame was passed down generation by generation, like an unwanted birthmark. So when the church looked out across its flocks and saw women, it didn't just see souls in need of saving, it saw potential traitors, vessels of temptation. And so it built an entire moral infrastructure to keep them in check. Rules about hair, clothing, silence, speech, marriage, obedience. But the more it tried to tighten control, the more it revealed how obsessed it was. Lust, ironically, was the sin they couldn't stop thinking about. There's something almost theatrical about it. Imagine a world where priests stand before you in ornately embroidered robes, faces pale with incense smoke, warning you of the dangers of lust, while behind closed doors they are poring over books that describe in vivid detail how witches summon demons with sex rites, how they use erotic charms, how they ride broomsticks naked under the moon. It's like a 15th century fan fiction circle, only it ends with a bonfire instead of a Tumblr post. The contradiction is almost funny until you realise the stakes. Because all this sexual suspicion wasn't abstract, it turned real, fast. Women were watched, judged, and sometimes executed not for casting spells but for violating sexual norms. A midwife who knew how to end a pregnancy might be accused of witchcraft. A widow who inherited her husband's land and didn't remarry? Suspicious? A woman who refused marriage altogether and lived alone? Definitely suspect. You start to feel it in your bones, the way the world shrinks when every glance or every gesture or every inch of visible skin might be read as an invitation or an accusation. And there's nowhere to go for safety, not even the cloistered walls of a convent. That's where it gets even darker. Because the church, while it preached celibacy and purity, also used those standards as surveillance tools. Nuns, often forced into vows by their families, weren't just devout, they were prisoners of an image. If a nun expressed passion, if she sang too sweetly, or if her cheeks flushed during prayer, it might be seen as evidence of spiritual failure, or worse, demonic influence. There were real cases of women in religious life being accused of witchcraft for experiencing what modern psychology would call arousal, or loneliness, or hallucinations caused by malnutrition. But back then, those were signs the devil had touched them. And it wasn't just women who were policed. Men too were warned constantly about the danger of lust, but with one important difference. When men fell, they were sinners. When women fell, they were witches. Here's a historical tidbit that's both fascinating and a little maddening. In the 12th century, church writers started classifying sins in detailed lists, like spiritual top tens, and lust always scored high. But while gluttony or envy might earn you a sermon or a little penance, lust, that could ruin your life, especially if someone else decided to blame you for theirs. One of the strangest little beliefs floating around at the time was this, that demons were actively trying to seduce monks and priests by taking the form of women. Sometimes real women, sometimes hallucinations conjured in moments of sleep or desire. But the line between dream and reality was fuzzy. If a monk had an erotic vision during the night, the official explanation might be that a witch had visited him in spirit. That way he wasn't at fault. She was. This belief created a horrifying loophole. Any woman could be accused simply because a man claimed to have dreamed about her. The guilt, like static, jumped bodies. Some church thinkers, like Thomas Aquinas, argued that demons didn't just tempt, they actively harvested semen to create more demons. So if a man had an involuntary sexual release during sleep, that fluid was supposedly used in hellish reproduction rituals. Yeah, you can't make this stuff up. Well, you can, apparently, and they did. But not everyone agreed. There were theological debates, often heated, about how much of this was real, and how much was fear gone wild. Some clerics insisted witches couldn't possibly fly or summon demons. Others believed the devil's power was limited, and that people were just projecting their own shame. But despite the skepticism, the fear won. The image of the sexually powerful woman, whether healer, midwife, widow or nun, became inextricably tied to Satan's schemes. And you start to see the bigger picture. Witchcraft wasn't just a spiritual threat. It was a social one, a way of maintaining order, of keeping everyone, especially women, in their place. Because if a woman could be blamed for lust, she could be controlled. And if she couldn't be controlled, she could be eliminated. You return home with your hood pulled low, a little more quiet, a little more cautious. A storm is coming, not in the sky, but in the whispers, in the glances, in the stories people tell themselves to make sense of desire, or to hide their own. You find yourself back inside a small smoky chapel. The priest is speaking again, but now his tone has shifted, more urgent, more trembling with the kind of dread that feels rehearsed. His voice echoes through the stone walls as he describes how the devil doesn't just tempt people with money or pride. No, his most insidious weapon is lust. And worst of all, he says, is when Satan doesn't do the tempting himself, he uses women, ordinary women, ones you've known your whole life. They smile too easily, walk too confidently, laugh too freely. They may not even know they're under his power, he warns, but their bodies are his playground. This to you feels a little unhinged, but to them it's doctrine. You shift in your seat, feeling the weight of the moment. This idea that sexuality is not just human, but actively demonic, is what will unravel lives for the next few centuries. Church authorities teach that the devil preys on weakness, and of all the sins in the medieval spiritual ranking system, lust is seen as the slipperiest. It doesn't need logic. It bypasses the brain. One moment you're saying your prayers, the next you're dreaming of someone's collarbone and wondering how skin could feel so forbidden and electric. Lust, they say, is the devil's favourite sport. the quickest shortcut to damnation. And women? They're not just victims of it, they're collaborators. Theologians, especially in the later Middle Ages, got real creative when writing about how temptation worked. Lust was described as an infection, a fire that could be transmitted through a gaze, a smile, or even just the presence of a woman in the wrong context. And because the female body was seen as naturally more carnal, more tied to flesh, emotion, chaos, it was assumed that women were more easily manipulated by dark forces. If a woman desired something, especially outside of marriage, it wasn't considered natural, it was witchcraft. There's this one passage from a 13th century bishop who claimed that women who engaged in unregulated pleasure opened themselves to demonic possession, like literally. The idea was that in the throes of lust, a woman's soul would slip out and a demon would slip in. Possession by orgasm. You can't even say that without rolling your eyes, but this was taken seriously, written in formal Latin, passed between scholars, preached from pulpits. Imagine a society where climax was considered a possible spiritual gateway for evil. And then remember that these people also controlled how you married, who you confessed to, and whether you got buried in consecrated ground. But here's a little twist. These thinkers weren't just afraid of women's desire, they were terrified of their own, and rather than admit that, they externalized it, turned it into a cosmic war. So if a monk had erotic thoughts, it couldn't be his fault. A demon tempted him. If a priest had an affair, the woman must have cast a spell. If a man sinned with his body, a woman had to take the fall. And the fall wasn't metaphorical. Take the example of the so-called seduction trials that start showing up more frequently after the 13th century. In these cases, a woman might be accused of using witchcraft to enchant a man, usually someone important, into sleeping with her. Not seduction, not mutual attraction. No, it must have been a spell, a charm, some whisper of the devil in her ear. This accusation was extremely convenient. It meant that a man's honour could be preserved and a woman could be discarded, or worse, punished publicly. Now let's talk about a word that shows up a lot in these old manuscripts. Concupiscence. It's an intense theological term for sexual longing, specifically the kind you can't control. Church doctrine taught that concupiscence was the devil's hook. The more intense your desire, the more likely it was that you were already compromised. And guess who was accused of spreading it? Witches. Women who wore red, women who danced, women who didn't cover their ankles, or who wore perfume, or who looked at a man too long. All of these were small breaches, but together they built a case. Even dreams weren't safe. If a man had a particularly vivid erotic dream, especially one involving someone he knew, it was thought that a succubus might be at work. Succubi were female demons who visited sleeping men to extract, let's say, life essence. But in many cases, people believed that real women were working in tandem with these spirits, that they sent them out, controlled them like some dark erotic courier service. And if a man said he dreamed of you, well, guess what? You were a suspect now. Let's pause here for a bizarre little belief that circulated in rural regions. It was thought that if a woman crossed your path after you'd had impure thoughts, and your crops failed, or your milk soured, she had cursed you through your lust. It wasn't just psychological guilt, it was agricultural. Your desire could kill your cow. That's the level of connection they were drawing between sex and spiritual chaos. There are even folk remedies in surviving texts that warn men to avoid touching their genitals after shaking hands with a woman who walked alone at night. Because, demon germs or something. And amid all this paranoia, open scholarly debate still managed to eke through. There were pockets of resistance, thinkers who said, wait a minute, aren't we projecting our own guilt here? Some early skeptics, particularly in university circles, argued that concupiscence was just a natural part of being human, not a supernatural attack vector. But their voices were often drowned out by the louder, more graphic ones. Because fear sells, fear sticks, and nothing makes people more afraid than the idea that their own desire is a gateway to eternal torment. So now, as you look around your village, or let's be honest, your room, you start to notice how deep these ideas go. That girl you had a crush on? Dangerous. That herbalist with the laugh lines and cat probably cursed your dreams, and that feeling in your stomach when you look at someone and feel drawn, fascinated, dizzy with want. That might not be love. That might be the devil. Or so they said. And so the link between sex and witchcraft didn't grow out of magic. It grew out of fear, shame, projection. a society desperate to control the uncontrollable, its own humanity. You walk back into the mist, wondering how many people were destroyed not because they practiced dark arts, but because someone else felt something they weren't supposed to. Desire, it turns out, was the real witch, and no one could exorcise it. You're back in the village square now, watching as someone, a child maybe, ties a string of dried flowers to a fence post. They're small, delicate things, probably meant to ward off illness or bring luck for the harvest. But to the wrong eyes, even that could look suspicious. Everything could. A smile, a song, a glance in the wrong direction, or, God forbid, a woman wearing her hair down. You hear the local priest again, his voice rattling down from the pulpit like a kettle drum. He's talking about vanity now. The devil delights in loosened hair, he says. It is a sign of rebellion, of unbridled lust. He says it like it's common knowledge, like everyone knows that women who don't tie back their hair are basically waving a flag for Satan. And here's the thing, in medieval Europe hair was no small matter. It was a loaded symbol, especially women's hair. Bound hair meant modesty, submission, control, letting it down. That was wildness, sensuality, danger. In religious art, saints always had their hair tucked beneath veils or tightly braided. Always neat, always covered. But Eve, Delilah, Jezebel, their hair flowed in long golden rivers or tangled knots, and that wasn't just artistic choice, it was moral messaging. Let's walk into a scriptorium for a moment, a quiet sunlit room where monks are copying texts by hand. In one corner, a friar is illustrating a page of Genesis. You peek over his shoulder and see Eve being expelled from Eden, her hair flying loose behind her like a banner of disgrace. That's how they framed it. Female hair wasn't just decorative, it was theological shorthand, a visible sign of moral character, or lack thereof. And this is where things get tricky, because hair, unlike other features, grows. It's natural, personal, always changing. You can't stop it from coming back. So controlling hair became a daily ritual of moral discipline, and the more sensual the culture imagined it to be, the more dangerous it became. There's a quirky folk belief from Germany around the 14th century. It was said that if a woman brushed her hair after dark, she was inviting spirits into the house. Not just any spirits either, lustful ones. Demons who would ride the strands down from heaven and slip through the window to seduce her. Now that's some supernatural conditioner. It's both absurd and telling. The brush, the strands, the act of grooming, it all becomes a sort of incantation, not because of what it is, but because of what people fear it might mean. Let's step into a town festival for a second. Music, roasted chestnuts, children running around with sticky hands. And over in the centre of the square, a group of women are dancing. Not wildly, not indecently, just dancing. Maybe one lets her braid come loose. Maybe a few strands fall across her cheek as she spins. Someone notices. Someone always notices. A man watches her, feels something stir. Something he wasn't expecting. By nightfall, a whisper's started. She dances too freely. She lets her hair down. She bewitched him. This wasn't limited to the peasants or superstitious country folk. Nobles and clergy bought into it too. There's a court record from a French province where a noblewoman was interrogated not for casting spells, but because she refused to cover her hair in church. She was described as proud and tempting. That was enough to start an inquiry. She wasn't burned, but her reputation never recovered. And then there were the nuns, women who had taken vows of chastity, who lived cloistered lives behind stone walls. You'd think they'd be safe from all this, but even they weren't exempt from hair-based paranoia. In some convents, nuns were required to shave their heads completely, not for hygiene, for humility, for protection, because even the suggestion of femininity, of softness, of sensuality was considered a spiritual risk. A nun with flowing hair was considered halfway to a succubus, and more than one was accused of ungodly vanity simply for tucking a ribbon behind her ear, or letting a curl peek from under her wimple. There's even a record of a woman being accused of witchcraft because her hair wouldn't stay tied back. She was described as having a mane like a lioness that refused to obey pins or scarves. They said it was unnatural, that no mortal woman could have hair so wild unless it was enchanted. Can you imagine standing trial because you had frizz? All of this, of course, traces back to control. If the church and the law and your neighbours could dictate how you wore your hair, they could dictate how you behaved, how you moved through the world, how you were allowed to feel, and especially how you were allowed to be seen. Visibility was power, and power for women was dangerous. Let's not pretend men were judged the same way. A scruffy monk wasn't considered possessed. A bearded knight didn't lose his social standing because he didn't comb his hair. But a woman, if her appearance drew attention, especially from men, it was her fault, her sin, or worse, her sorcery. That's the cruel paradox. A woman could be punished for looking desirable, but also punished for trying not to. Wear makeup and you're a temptress. Don't and you're a hag. Smile too much? You're leading people on. Don't smile? You're cold or hiding something. But the hair, the hair. That was the real battleground. Because it was always there, always visible, always whispering to the people around you, even if you stayed silent. Scholars today still debate the origins of this obsession. Was it purely religious? Was it a holdover from Roman and pagan customs that venerated hair as sacred and symbolic? Was it just another way to enforce patriarchy with divine backup? Probably all of the above, but no matter the cause, the result was the same. Generations of women lived under suspicion because they couldn't hide the natural beauty of their own heads. You walk past a mirror now, maybe a polished sheet of metal, or still water in a basin, and catch a glimpse of yourself. You imagine what it must have felt like to live under that scrutiny every day, to constantly second-guess whether you should tie your hair back tighter, whether someone might accuse you of seduction just because of the way the wind caught your braid. And maybe you wonder, just for a second, whether you'd be brave enough to leave it loose. Night falls again, and with it comes the kind of silence that makes your skin crawl. Somewhere beyond the walls of your room is an owl hoots once and then goes still. You can hear your own breath, the fire's down to embers now, and in the half-light your imagination starts filling in the gaps. Because this is when it happens, they say, when the real danger begins. Not in daylight, not in the public square. No, it's at night, when the veil between worlds grows thin and something unnatural slips through your window. And if you've ever woken from a dream, flushed, sweaty heart pounding, well, then maybe you've already been visited. Welcome to the twisted world of incubi and succubi, those slippery little figures from medieval folklore who show up just in time to make your sleep very weird. An incubus, if you're unfamiliar, is a male demon that lies atop a sleeping woman and engages in, let's say, inappropriate activities without her consent. His female counterpart, the succubus, does the same to men. But here's the medieval twist. People didn't just treat these visitations as nightmares or stress dreams. They treated them as real, tangible, physical encounters, ones that could leave marks, cause illness, and most importantly, be blamed on witchcraft. It starts innocently enough. A man confesses to his priest that he's been waking up with certain sensations, shameful ones, maybe dreams involving a neighbour or a former lover, or worse, someone he shouldn't even be thinking about. The priest listens gravely and tells him, "It wasn't you, it was a succubus." The man breathes easier. Of course, he's not sinful, he's under attack. But then comes the follow-up question. Who sent her? That's the real hook. Because demons don't act alone in these stories. They're summoned, guided, or partnered with witches. So now it's not just a dream, it's an accusation. Someone must have cursed him. A woman he saw at the well, a girl he passed in town. Maybe she looked too calm, too confident. Or maybe she simply existed in a body that stirred something he couldn't explain. And that's how a sleep paralysis episode turns into a witch trial. You sit by the fire thinking about how terrifying that would be. To be blamed not for what you've done, but for what someone else dreamed. Because the incubus wasn't just a convenient excuse, it became legal evidence. If a man claimed he'd been visited in the night, and if he could name a woman he suspected of sending the demon, the wheels of justice could start grinding. She could be questioned, tortured, put on trial, all because of a dream. In the 14th and 15th centuries, these stories explode across Europe. People genuinely believed that demons were having sex with humans in their sleep, and they weren't just ethereal phantoms. Oh no, some accounts describe physical details, the coldness of the demon's touch, the smell of sulphur, the weight pressing down on the chest, the inability to move or scream. Sounds a lot like modern descriptions of sleep paralysis, but back then, that was seen as first-hand proof. Here's a quirky little fringe theory that really made the rounds. Some theologians believed that incubi and succubi were actually the same demon, just shape-shifting. The idea was that the demon would first appear as a succubus, collect semen from a man, then transform into an incubus and impregnate a woman with it, which is a lot. There's also the small matter of people believing that these resulting pregnancies could produce supernatural offspring, sometimes called cambions, which is honestly a pretty metal name for demon babies. Scholars in later centuries tried to argue this all away as hysteria, as projections of sexual repression and guilt. And sure, they had a point. But back then, none of that mattered. All that mattered was that people were terrified of their own bodies, of desire, of dreams, and instead of confronting those feelings, they turned them into monsters, literal ones. And this monster, it had gender. Male victims of succubi were often treated as passive, unfortunate, even holy. Some monks claimed their resistance made them more saintly. But women who were visited by incubi, completely different story. Instead of being pitied, they were often suspected of wanting it, of inviting it, and that slippery slope from victim to seductress to witch was short and steep. There's a trial record from northern Italy in the early 1500s where a young woman was accused of allowing a demon into her bed. She swore it wasn't her fault, that she woke up to its presence, terrified and paralysed. But the inquisitors weren't buying it. They questioned her appearance, her tone, even the way she moved her hands when she talked. Eventually, under pressure, she confessed, not just to consorting with the incubus, but to enjoying it. That one word sealed her fate. Pleasure, even involuntary, was proof of sin, proof of cooperation. You think about that for a long time, because behind all these stories is a simple, awful truth. The human body, especially a woman's body, was seen as inherently dangerous, not just because it could tempt, but because it could react, and any reaction that suggested pleasure, even in a nightmare, was treated as betrayal. Of course, not everyone believed in literal demons. Some physicians of the time suggested that these experiences were the result of vapours or bad digestion. There's even a 15th century medical manuscript that attributes nighttime arousal to an excess of melancholic humours caused by sleeping on your back. So, in case you were wondering, yes, bad dreams could be blamed on your sleeping position. Still, the supernatural explanation won out in the cultural imagination. It was cleaner, more dramatic, easier to rally a community around. After all, if someone in town had the power to send demons into your bedroom, wouldn't you want them caught? So now every restless night, every uncomfortable dream becomes a reason to look sideways at someone. To remember the way that widow looked at you, or how that girl laughed when your horse stumbled. Maybe it wasn't her fault. Or maybe she whispered something while churning butter and invited the devil in. You curl deeper under your blanket, listening to the wind scrape against the shutters. And even though you know better, you can't help wondering if something brushed your foot tonight, something you couldn't see. What would you say in the morning? Dawn breaks slowly over the village, the light creeping in like it's testing the air for safety. The sky's washed out pink, and the rooftops still shimmer with dew, but already there's movement on the street. Women hauling water, men heading toward fields, chickens kicking up dust. It all looks normal, quiet even, but you can feel it underneath. The tension, the sense that everyone's waiting for something to go wrong, and when it does, they'll know exactly who to blame. This fear doesn't start with witches, not really. It starts with Eve. From the moment medieval Christianity got its claws into European life, the story of Eve was more than just a cautionary tale. It was a template. She wasn't simply the first woman, she was the first failure, the first to be tempted, the first to tempt someone else, and that idea that sin entered the world through feminine weakness became the foundation for centuries of suspicion and suppression. You sit through Sunday Mass and hear it in the scripture. Eve took the fruit, Eve listened to the serpent, Eve gave it to Adam, and boom, paradise gone, everyone's naked, and now you need a priest just to make it through the week without damning yourself. The message is clear. Women open the door to the devil, and the only way to keep that door shut? Total obedience, total chastity, total silence. That's a pretty tall order, especially for actual human beings, and it creates this horrible paradox. On the one hand, women are seen as spiritually inferior, more emotional, more gullible, more prone to temptation, but on the other, they're considered powerful enough to bring down all of humanity. Which is it? Are women weak or are they dangerous? Turns out they're both. Weak in virtue, strong in sin. That's how the church framed it. And it wasn't just in sermons. It was everywhere. In law, in medicine, in art, in the way people looked at you when you walked by. The belief in inherited guilt meant that every woman carried a piece of Eve's original mistake. Her body was a living reminder of the fall. Her menstrual cycles were proof. Her childbirth pain was punishment. Her ability to entice, to distract, to draw attention, that was her danger. A woman didn't need to say a word to commit a sin. Just being visible was enough. This belief wasn't just spiritual, it was institutional. In court records from the 13th and 14th centuries, you'll see women described as daughters of Eve, when accused of everything from gossip to adultery to, of course, witchcraft. It wasn't just poetic, it was legal shorthand for moral instability. Judges genuinely believed that women were less capable of resisting temptation, and therefore more likely to be working with the devil. So if something went wrong, a child died, a man got sick, a crop failed, people didn't just ask what caused it. They asked who, and that who was usually someone already marked by suspicion. Someone whose existence reminded them of Eve. Let's wander into a university hall in Paris for a moment. Candles flicker on wooden desks as young clerics debate theology. The question tonight, why are women more susceptible to demonic influence? One student quotes Augustine, another Aquinas. They argue not just about scripture, but about anatomy. Some claim women's bodies are colder, moister, more easily penetrated by spiritual forces. Others say women are more emotionally unstable, therefore more likely to make pacts with demons. It's all said with scholarly seriousness, like they're discussing weather patterns. But what they're really doing is building a case that half the population is naturally suspect. Now zoom out from the university to the rural town square. A girl's goat gets sick, and someone remembers she was humming by the well last Tuesday. Was it a tune she learned from her mother, or from something darker? A rumour starts. She's a little too pretty, a little too curious. Her grandmother was odd, wasn't she? Had a cat, wore strange herbs. The whispers echo. And before long, that girl is standing in front of a judge who already thinks she's guilty because she's human and female, and Eve's blood runs in her veins. But here's where things get especially twisted. The idea of women as inherently sinful wasn't just used to justify persecution, it was used to justify control. If women couldn't be trusted to make moral decisions, then they needed constant oversight, from fathers, brothers, husbands, priests. If they were always teetering on the edge of temptation, they needed rules about where they could go, who they could talk to, what they could wear, even what kind of extrakim they could show on their faces. Anything too joyful, too clever, too confident, suspicious. You start to realise how the myth of Eve didn't just shape belief, it shaped daily life. Women had to perform modesty to constantly prove they weren't dangerous. They had to become shadows of themselves, suppressing personality, sexuality, even knowledge, all to avoid waking the old suspicion that they might be following in Eve's footsteps. But not everyone bought into the guilt. There were women, sharp, stubborn, brilliant women, who pushed back. You see them in the margins of history. Nuns who wrote poetry, midwives who preserved ancient knowledge, female mystics who described divine visions that weren't about sin but about power. These women didn't just passively accept their supposed weakness, they redefined it, reclaimed it. In some cases, they were respected. In others, they were burned. There's one case that stands out. The story of a woman healer accused of witchcraft after treating a noble's daughter with herbs and prayers. During her trial, she argued that her knowledge came from God, not demons, that healing was holy, that Eve's curse wasn't a death sentence, it was a call to understand pain and alleviate it. The judges didn't agree. She was executed anyway. But in the records, her voice lingers. Clear, defiant, refusing to carry shame for something she didn't cause. And that's what makes this whole thing so bitter. The punishment wasn't just for sin, it was for refusing to carry the weight of someone else's. You stand now at the edge of a field, watching the sun come up over the thatched rooftops. The light feels warm for once, but still you wonder, if Eve had been born in a different time, if her story had been told by someone else, would any of this have happened? Or would we have learned to see temptation not as a curse, but as a choice? Smoke curls from a nearby chimney as you follow a narrow dirt path leading away from the village and into the trees. The forest feels quiet, too quiet, like it's holding its breath, waiting for your foot to break a twig. You're on your way to see someone people don't talk about out loud but still depend on more than they'd admit. The midwife, the herbalist, the woman with bottles on her shelves, dried roots hanging from the rafters, and knowledge passed down from hands, not books. She might be the one who helped your sister through childbirth, or the one who knew how to stop the bleeding when your neighbour fell on his scythe. She's also the woman everyone stares at just a little too long, because healing in this time and place often walks the edge of heresy. She opens the door before you knock. There's a knowing in her eyes, the kind that comes from watching a lot of people come into this world and sometimes leave it too soon. Her house smells like something between a garden and a storm cellar. Lavender and damp stone, maybe. It's quiet here and safe, but you also know that if someone decided she was dangerous, it wouldn't matter what good she's done. They wouldn't see medicine, they'd see magic. And they'd call it witchcraft, because in medieval Europe, knowing too much, especially about the human body, was a dangerous game. And if you were a woman who knew about reproduction, who understood the timing of a cycle, how to use herbs to ease labour or stop it entirely, then people assumed you weren't just meddling in nature, you were interfering with God's plan. And when people feared what you knew, they didn't just avoid you, they accused you. Midwives were in a unique position. They were essential, every town needed one, but also deeply suspect. They handled blood, birth, pain, fluids, death, all the messy taboo stuff that the church didn't want to touch, literally or spiritually. And because most male physicians wouldn't go near a birthing room, women stepped into that void with their own systems of knowledge, rooted in experience, trial and error, folk wisdom, and yes, sometimes superstition. Now here's where things get spicy. There were records, especially from inquisitors, that claim midwives didn't just help with birth. They were gatekeepers for demonic rituals. According to the Malleus Maleficarum, that notorious witch-hunting manual, midwives were accused of murdering infants during birth, offering them to the devil, or using their blood for potions. Total fiction, obviously, but people believed it. Why? Because the alternative was to admit that sometimes babies die, or that childbirth is traumatic, or that maybe God doesn't control everything as neatly as the sermons say. And so when things went wrong, a baby was stillborn, a mother bled to death, or a child grew up with a disability, someone had to be blamed. That someone was usually the person who had been there. The woman who knew where to press, what tea to brew, how to turn a breech baby, the healer, the helper, the witch. There's a record of one trial in rural Switzerland, early 1400s, where a midwife named Brigitte was accused after 3 infants died within the same month. It was winter. The roads were blocked by snow. She had no supplies, no help, and the mothers were malnourished. But when the 3rd baby died, someone remembered seeing her sprinkle something into a cup of water. That's all it took. She was questioned. She confessed under torture, said she made a pact with the devil in exchange for knowledge of women's secrets. She was burned within the week, and you start to see how fragile the line is, how easily it breaks. A woman could be a saviour one day and a scapegoat the next. Her skill, her competence, the very things that kept her community alive, those became the reasons to fear her. Here's a strange little fact that'll stick in your mind for a while. Some people believed midwives could determine the gender of a baby, not just during pregnancy, but before conception, by reading signs in the moon or interpreting the dreams of the mother. Others claimed that midwives could curse a womb, sealing it shut with just a glance or a whispered phrase. Again, nothing remotely true, but these myths spread like wildfire because they explain the unexplainable. And because deep down people don't like the idea that pain might be random, it's easier to think someone caused it, someone you can punish. The fear wasn't just local either. Church authorities began issuing formal warnings about midwives. Manuals instructed bishops to watch carefully those women who are present at births, for often their hands are turned not toward God but toward the devil. In some regions, midwives were required to register with the church, to take oaths under threat of excommunication. They had to publicly swear they would not use herbs or charms during labour. They weren't just healers anymore, they were suspects on parole. But what gets lost in all this paranoia is the reality. These women were often the only source of care in a crisis. They were the ones who stayed up all night with a labouring mother, who carried home the body of a stillborn child, who cried in secret because they blamed themselves even when they'd done everything right. They lived close to life and death, and that kind of proximity scares people, especially people who have never had to face either up close. There's a quote from an anonymous midwife scribbled in the margins of a 15th century herbal. "They call us witches because we know what they fear, blood and how to stop it." It's not poetry, it's a quiet war cry, because to be a midwife in medieval Europe was to walk a razor's edge, revered when needed, reviled when feared. You leave her cottage feeling heavier than when you arrived. The trees don't whisper anymore. The forest just watches, and you understand now, maybe for the first time, why so many women burned for doing nothing more than understanding their own bodies and trying to help others survive theirs. You find yourself inside stone walls again, but this time it's different, quieter, more hushed than sacred. There's the faint scent of beeswax candles and drying herbs, mingling with something older, books, dust, secrets. This isn't a village house or a healer's cottage. You're standing in a convent, a fortress of female silence. The women here have taken vows, to poverty, to chastity, to obedience. They've sworn off the world, or at least that's what they're supposed to have done. But the truth, whispered between cloisters and hinted at in old confessions, is that even here, things aren't so pure. Desire doesn't die when you walk through a heavy wooden door. It waits. Sometimes it simmers, sometimes it burns. And when it shows up in a place like this, people call it something else, something unholy, something demonic. Welcome to the story of nuns behaving badly, and the twisted ways their supposed sins were folded into the great fear of witchcraft. The church thought it had a solution to Eve's mistake. It built walls around women, gave them habits and hymnals, and told them that silence and service would keep them safe from temptation. But not all women joined convents out of spiritual devotion. Some were sent there by fathers who didn't want to pay dowries. Some were widows with no heirs. Some were young girls, practically children, pushed into vows they didn't understand, and once inside they were expected to transform, to become brides of Christ, to lock away their bodies and desires forever. But bodies don't work like that, and neither does longing. There are stories, true documented stories, of nuns who fell in love with visiting priests, or with each other. Stories of secret letters, smuggled kisses, locked doors that stayed shut too long. Sometimes it was tenderness, sometimes it was desperation. But when these moments came to light, the consequences were brutal, not just because they broke the rules, but because the church had no real way of understanding female sexuality unless it was tied to either sainthood or Satan. If a nun expressed passion, it couldn't be natural. So the explanation? Witchcraft. Let's look at a case that made serious waves. Sister Benedetta Carlini, a 17th century abbess in Italy. She claimed to receive divine visions, sacred messages, ecstatic experiences with angels. For a while she was celebrated as a mystic. Her fame grew, people travelled to see her. But eventually whispers began. Strange behaviour, secret meetings with another nun, confessions that veered too far into the physical. When the church investigated, they didn't just strip her of her title, they interrogated her under the assumption that her visions had been faked, inspired by carnal desire, or worse, demonic manipulation. And this wasn't some one-off anomaly. Across Europe, when convents faced scandal, whether it was an affair, a pregnancy, or even rumours of inappropriate dreams, the accused women were often labelled as witches, not just sinners, witches. Because if you were supposed to be married to God and ended up tangled in a very human kind of passion, something supernatural had to be at work. A woman of God couldn't fall unless she was pushed. Here's a strange little side note that's equal parts fascinating and messed up. There was a widespread belief that nuns were especially vulnerable to possession, not because they were sinful, but because they were pure. That purity, ironically, was seen as fragile, as if innocence attracted darkness. So if a nun started speaking in tongues, or shaking during prayer, or experiencing religious ecstasies that looked a little too much like arousal, it wasn't interpreted as emotional overwhelm or psychological stress. It was the devil, or a demon, or the lingering influence of witchcraft. That gave rise to another phenomenon, mass possessions. Whole convents full of nuns suddenly convulsing, screaming, tearing at their veils. The most famous example? Loudun, France, 1632. The Ursuline nuns there claimed they were being tormented by invisible demons sent by a priest named Urbain Grandier. What followed was a mix of theatre and horror. Public exorcisms, sexualized accusations, demonic confession transcripts that read more like something from a pulp novel than a spiritual investigation. Grandier was burned. The nuns? They were sequestered, examined, treated. Some scholars now believe it was mass hysteria, a kind of trauma response trapped inside too many bodies told never to feel. But even earlier than Loudun, similar stories bubbled up across convents, whispers of orgiastic visions of nuns visited by incubi in the night. of female saints whose holy ecstasies were uncomfortably close to physical ones. And if a woman's faith was too intense, if she described divine experiences in language too sensual, it made people nervous. Was she touched by God or someone else? And so the church found itself in a double bind. It wanted women to be spiritually pure, but not too ecstatic, obedient, but not passionate, holy, but not powerful. And when nuns stepped out of line, when their humanity showed through, it wasn't seen as rebellion, it was seen as evidence of witchcraft. You take a seat in the cold stone chapel, listening to the drip of water echoing off the high ceiling. You imagine the silence here at night, the kind that's too deep, too still. You think about a young woman, barely 17, lying awake in her narrow bed, trying to pray away feelings she doesn't understand. She's been told that God will protect her, that saints don't feel what she feels, that holiness means silence. But when the silence gets too loud, when the desire doesn't fade, what's left for her? Sometimes she writes, sometimes she cries, sometimes she breaks. And when she does, the world doesn't ask what she needed, it asks what possessed her. There were scholars back then, men of course, who tried to explain it all away. Hormonal imbalance, melancholia, wandering womb syndrome, which was as ridiculous then as it sounds now. But none of these explanations were as powerful or as dangerous as the belief in demonic influence. That gave the church control, that gave inquisitors a reason to intervene. And so the convent, cities meant to be a haven, becomes another kind of prison, one where even your thoughts can betray you, where your dreams might be used as evidence, where your love, any kind of love, becomes a crime. You leave the chapel and walk back into the fading light, carrying a weight that doesn't entirely belong to you. You understand now that even behind high walls and locked gates, a woman's body was never really her own. Not in the eyes of a world that saw sin in softness. And when purity became impossible, the only thing left to see was a witch. The road back into town winds through low hills and golden grass, the kind that whispers around your ankles and makes you feel like something is following even when it's just the wind. You reach the village just as the sun dips low, turning everything the colour of old parchment. Ahead, near the church steps, a small crowd has gathered. People are murmuring, some openly gawking, and in the middle of it all you spot a man in a black robe holding a leather-bound book in one hand and a crucifix in the other. He's reading aloud and his voice has that flat, bone-dry tone that says he believes every word, and expects you to as well. He's reading from the Malleus Maleficarum. Just hearing the name makes your stomach tighten. Translated as the Hammer of Witches, this 15th century text is arguably the most infamous witch-hunting manual ever written. It sounds like something metalheads would shout before a concert, but really it's more like a bureaucratic how-to guide for destroying lives. Think of it as part theological screed, part legal instruction manual, and part obsessive sex fantasy masquerading as holy war. And if that sounds unhinged, it is. The book was written in 1486 by two German inquisitors, Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger. Well, mostly Kramer, with Sprenger's name tacked on later for credibility. Kramer was the kind of guy who saw the devil in everything. Your cow gets sick, your child has a rash, you dreamed about someone with nice calves. Satan's work. But his particular obsession was with women. Specifically women who made men feel things, because in Kramer's world, if a woman stirred your loins, she was probably stirring a cauldron too. The Malleus goes deep, uncomfortably deep, into the mechanics of female sexuality, claiming that women are more carnal than men, have loose tongues and insatiable passions, and are therefore more susceptible to demonic influence. In other words, your average 15th century woman, just existing in her body, was a spiritual landmine, and the only way to keep society safe, root them out, question them, break them if necessary. It's not a small book, hundreds of pages. It outlines how to identify a witch, how to interrogate her, what questions to ask, and what answers to expect. It even lists the exact words a witch might use to confess, helpfully anticipating everything from demonic pacts to sexual congress with Satan. It's disturbingly thorough. The tone is cold, clinical, but the content, it's obsessive, repetitive, almost gleeful in its descriptions of female sexuality turned monstrous. Here's a direct paraphrase. Witches will cause men's genitals to vanish, render husbands impotent, use potions to enslave lovers, and engage in sexual acts with demons who take the form of beasts, black men, or seductive strangers. It reads less like theology, and more like someone's fever dream journal. You can't help but wonder if Heinrich Kramer wrote this thing with one hand. The most telling part, though, is how the book treats pleasure. It frames female sexual enjoyment not just as sin, but as the fuel that powers witchcraft. A woman who enjoys sex is already halfway to hell, because in this logic, pleasure can't be natural, it has to be stolen, borrowed from the devil. So when a woman expresses desire, the church doesn't ask what she feels, it asks what she's hiding. You sit down on a nearby bench watching the crowd lean in as the priest quotes from the chapter on interrogation. He reads aloud the recommended techniques: binding, sleep deprivation, pressing, water trials, always with a warning not to believe the first answer, because witches lie. They lie instinctively, the book says, just like they sin instinctively. And that means the only truth worth believing is the one dragged out through pain. And here's the chilling part. This book wasn't some dusty scroll forgotten in a monastery. It was a bestseller, reprinted dozens of times across Europe. It was used in courtrooms, cited in sermons, trusted by judges. It gave a thin veneer of scholarship to the act of torture. It wrapped misogyny in Latin and called it law. One of the weirdest fringe claims in the book, and there are plenty, is that witches could steal male virility and store it in nests of birds or hidden in tree hollows. Yes, you read that right. According to Kramer, a man's genitals could be physically taken and kept in a box, and witches would feed them like pets. It's somewhere between horror story and cartoon, but it was believed, taken seriously. If someone had performance issues in the bedroom, there wasn't a need to examine diet or stress. No, a witch must have snatched his manhood and tucked it away like a hamster. There were theologians and legal scholars who pushed back, who said the Malleus was over the top, even dangerous, but their voices were often lost in the rising tide of panic, because the book didn't just reinforce old fears, it gave them structure. It turned suspicion into a step-by-step manual. It made witch hunting into a job, complete with procedures and protocols. You didn't have to think, you just had to follow the book. And what's perhaps most sinister about the Malleus is how it pretends to be logical. It uses the language of reason, of careful argument, even though it begins with an assumption that women are guilty by nature. Everything flows from that. If she cries under torture, she's faking. If she doesn't cry, proof of her unnatural strength. If she confesses, obvious guilt. If she refuses, that's the devil talking. You step away from the crowd, the priest's voice still echoing behind you. The air feels tight, like the atmosphere's been pulled too thin. You realise the real danger isn't witches, it's certainty. The kind of rigid, righteous certainty that needs no evidence, only belief. And the Malleus Maleficarum gave people permission to believe the worst about women and call it holy. You pass an old woman sitting on her doorstep. She looks about tired. You wonder what someone like Kramer would see in her. A healer, a mother, a seductress, a monster. In a world ruled by that book, it hardly matters. All it takes is a glance, a dream, a rumour, and suddenly a woman's entire life is one chapter away from being turned into a confession. You're sitting in the back of a tavern now, warm and smoky, the kind of place where the wine is thin, the gossip is thick, and everyone's pretending they're not eavesdropping. The fire crackles, a dog sleeps by the hearth, and near the far table, two women are whispering over a shared cup. One of them has a scrap of red cloth tied around her wrist. The other pulls a small pouch from her apron and hands it over like it's contraband, which in a way it is. You lean in just a little closer. "Slip this into his drink," she says, "and he'll be yours by morning." Ah, love potions. Or, if you were a church official in medieval Europe, lust spells. And these, more than broomsticks, black cats, or boiling cauldrons, were the kinds of magic that made people panic. Erotic charms, passion brews, enchantments of desire. You see, while most folks imagine witches cursing crops or summoning storms, the real fear, the one that kept husbands up at night and monks pacing their cells, was this: that someone could take control of your body, make you feel something you didn't choose, or worse, make you enjoy it. And that fear zeroed in on women. In a world where most marriages were arranged, where love was rare and sex was more duty than delight, the idea that a woman might use magic to inspire passion, especially in someone who shouldn't feel it, was deeply unsettling. It flipped the script. It gave her power. And for many men, power plus sexuality equals witchcraft. Let's talk ingredients. These so-called love spells weren't the bubbling green goo Hollywood would have you believe. They were simple. Herbs like mandrake root, known for its strange human-like shape and long-standing associations with fertility. Damiana, said to stir desire. Rose petals, honey, blood, sweat, sometimes even hair. That's right. Mixing hair into wine was a surprisingly common folk recipe for binding someone's heart, or at least their libido. In some regions, women whispered spells over the hair before hiding it under mattresses or stirring it into soup. These weren't elaborate rituals, they were homegrown traditions, passed down from grandmother to daughter, born from desperation and curiosity, not evil. But when church and court got wind of them, they weren't seen as quaint or harmless. They were seen as manipulations of the divine order. And that, to the powers that be, was a crime. You sip from your own cup now and imagine what it must have felt like. To be a young girl, watching the boy you like marry someone richer, someone picked by his father. Or to be a wife with a husband who barely speaks to you, who slips away to the barn at night or leaves bruises you can't explain. Maybe you hear about a route, a charm, a way to bring him back, to feel wanted, to feel safe, and you try it. A leaf tucked in a pillow, a whispered word over your stew. You don't think you're doing anything wicked. You think you're surviving, but then he touches you, smiles at you, and someone notices. That's how the stories start. A man's behaviour changes, and someone blames his lover. Suddenly, it's not affection, it's enchantment. The woman didn't win him. She stole him. She bewitched him. Even worse, he might say it himself, claim he couldn't help it. But he was overpowered by desire. His guilt shifts, sharpens, points away from him and directly at her. And suddenly, she's not just a flirt, she's a witch. There's an infamous case in 15th century Spain where a woman was accused of bewitching a local official into sleeping with her. She confessed under torture to using a love potion made with her own blood, herbs, and a lock of his hair. Whether it ever actually happened or not is beside the point. The idea that such a potion could exist was enough to terrify the court. They burned her for it. Said her charm violated the natural order of things, as if real love never did that on its own. And here's a fun little wrinkle. While women were often accused of casting these spells, men used them too. But when men used love magic, it was framed differently. Less threatening, more like a game or prank, and a lovesick bard reciting a charm was poetic. A woman doing the same? Sinister. Erotic magic was gendered. Men got fantasy, women got fire. Some of these so-called spells were disguised prayers. In older texts, you'll find women writing appeals to saints asking for romantic attention or fertility. But if those prayers rhymed, or if they included non-canonical saints, especially female ones, then they might be labelled heretical. Magic in a dress, basically. Even flowers had associations. A woman caught planting certain herbs in her garden, valerian, mugwort, rue, could be questioned, because those weren't just for healing, they were aphrodisiacal, and the line between garden and grimoire was always razor thin. The church didn't just dislike these practices, it feared them because they offered an alternative source of agency. If a woman didn't need a priest to secure her husband's love, or if she could escape her loneliness with a whisper and a cup of tea that undermined the entire patriarchal structure, and so any attempt to claim erotic power, even through superstition, became cause for suspicion. Here's one of the more bizarre beliefs that made the rounds. It was said that if a woman gave a man a drink while she was menstruating, especially if she looked him directly in the eyes while doing it, she could bind him to her forever. The logic? Menstrual blood was believed to have magical properties, often dark ones, and anything tied to the womb, pleasure, or female cycles was inherently unstable, dangerous, witchy. Of course, modern historians read these accusations and see deeper meanings. The use of erotic magic was often about women trying to gain even a shred of control in a society that gave them none. It wasn't about bewitching men, it was about not being invisible, and that made it revolutionary, which is probably why it had to be crushed. You watch the two women finish their drink and head back into the night, their figures fading down the alley like shadows with secrets. You wonder if the pouch was real, if the spell was meant seriously, or if it was just comfort wrapped in cloth. Either way, you know the risks. If someone finds out, if the wrong person sees, those women might end up on a platform in the square, accused of summoning demons when all they wanted was love. It's raining now, soft, steady, a drizzle that makes everything feel heavier. The cobblestones gleam like wet teeth underfoot, and smoke drifts low from the chimneys as people huddle indoors. You duck beneath an awning near the courthouse, watching as two guards lead a woman inside, hands bound, face streaked with mud and tears. She's not struggling, just walking slow and quiet, like she knows exactly how this ends. And if the past is any guide, she probably does, because this is the trial. You slip inside too, quiet as breath, taking a spot near the back. The room smells of damp wood and sour fear. There's no jury, just a judge, a clerk scratching notes, a few onlookers pretending to be indifferent. The woman stands alone in the centre, flanked by 2 guards with their arms crossed like they have already decided she's guilty. And to be fair, so is everyone else. The clerk begins to read. Her name, her occupation, the charges, witchcraft, heresy, seduction, consorting with demons, the usual. Then come the details, and this is where it turns from legal to lurid. He describes how she was seen walking near the woods alone, how she spoke kindly to a married man at the market, how someone claimed to hear strange noises from her house at night. Then, as if rehearsed, he reads her confession. It's not short. She admits to casting spells, luring men to her bed, whispering curses while they slept. She describes a black dog that follows her at night, a dream where the devil came to her as a handsome man with burning eyes. She says they danced. He kissed her, touched her, promised her pleasure and power in exchange for her loyalty. She confesses to signing a book in blood, to flying through the air, to unspeakable things done under the full moon. The audience shifts. Some gasp, some avert their eyes. But you're frozen, because none of it sounds real. It sounds written, constructed, like a story built from pieces everyone already knows, like something pulled straight from the Malleus Maleficarum or whispered gossip after too much ale. And it is. Because confessions like this were never clean, never voluntary, and almost never true. Most of them were carved out through torture. Thumbs crushed, her feet scorched, sleep stolen day after day until reality cracked, and the only way out was to say what they wanted. And what they wanted, more often than not, was something erotic. The Inquisitors always circled back to sex. Who did you touch? Who touched you? What did it feel like? Did you like it? Did the devil kiss your thighs? Did you scream? These weren't questions about crime. They were fantasies dressed in robes. The confessions weren't evidence. They were theatre. A ritual of humiliation disguised as truth. Take this actual line from a 16th century trial record. She confessed that the devil came to her in the form of a beautiful man, that his embrace was cold as stone, yet her body did not resist him. That's not law, that's pulp fiction. And yet these confessions were used to justify burning someone alive. And here's where it gets even darker. Once a woman confessed to having sex with a demon, her body became evidence. Literally. Inspectors, usually men, were authorised to search her for witch marks. Moles, scars, skin tags, birthmarks. Any blemish could be interpreted as the devil's brand, and if she cried or screamed during the exam, that was taken as proof she was hiding something. If she didn't, then she was obviously possessed. So imagine standing there, stripped, touched by strangers, your skin treated like a crime scene. And no matter how you respond, it makes you guiltier. You glance back at the woman standing before the court. She's not crying now, just staring at the wall like she's somewhere far away. And maybe she is. Maybe she's remembering the herbs in her garden, the warmth of her cat curled by the fire, the last normal day before someone pointed and said her name. The judge asks if she has anything to say. She doesn't. Or maybe she knows it won't matter. Because in these trials, innocence was never the goal. Confession was. Spectacle was. And humiliation? That was baked into the process. You think of another case, not this woman, but one from France, late 1400s, a widow mid-40s, accused of causing a neighbour's impotence. He swore that after refusing her romantic advances, he could no longer perform with his wife. She denied it, of course, but under torture, she admitted to stealing a piece of his clothing and burying it beneath a tree. That, she said, made his manhood wither. She said she regretted it, that her jealousy overtook her. She was hanged a week later. Was it true? Probably not, but it satisfied the narrative. It made his failure someone else's fault. And that's the pattern, again and again. These confessions sound theatrical because they are. They have rhythm, plot points, even arcs. First the seduction, then the pact, then the climax, always literal, always described in a way too much detail, and finally the regret. A neat little moral package. Sin, pleasure, consequence. The kind of story that fits comfortably in a sermon or a court record. There were some who objected, jurists and scholars who said confessions under torture were worthless. that they prove nothing except that pain makes people say anything. But those voices were drowned out, because these trials weren't about justice, they were about reassurance. Reassurance that evil had a face, that it could be named, chained and burned, that you could point to someone and say, "There, that's the danger, not me, her." The clerk finishes reading. The judge nods solemnly. Sentence will be passed tomorrow, but the outcome's already written in the air. The woman is led away again, feet dragging, head bowed. And as the crowd disperses, no one speaks her name. You walk back into the rain, chilled by more than the wind. You think of all the women who were forced to become characters in someone else's nightmare, who confess to fantasies not their own, who are punished for the same desire the judges denied by day and dreamed about at night. And you wonder what kind of world needs its courtroom confessions to read like erotica, just to feel safe. It's raining now, soft, steady, a drizzle that makes everything feel heavier. The cobblestones gleam like wet teeth underfoot, and smoke drifts low from chimneys as people huddle indoors. You duck beneath an awning near the courthouse, watching as 2 guards lead a woman inside, hands bound, face streaked with mud and tears. She's not struggling, just walking, slow and quiet, like she knows exactly how this ends, and if the past is any guide, she probably does, because this is the trial. You slip inside too, quiet as breath, taking a spot near the back. The room smells of damp wood and sour fear. There's no jury, just a judge, a clerk scratching notes, a few onlookers pretending to be indifferent. The woman stands alone in the centre, flanked by 2 guards with their arms crossed like they have already decided she's guilty. And to be fair, so is everyone else. The clerk begins to read. Her name, her occupation, the charges, witchcraft, heresy, seduction, consorting with demons. The usual, but then come the details, and this is where it turns from legal to lurid. He describes how she was seen walking near the woods alone, how she spoke kindly to a married man at the market, how someone claimed to hear strange noises from her house at night. Then, as if rehearsed, he reads her confession. It's not short. She admits to casting spells, luring men to her bed, whispering curses while they slept. She describes a black dog that follows her at night, a dream where the devil came to her as a handsome man with burning eyes. She says they danced. He kissed her, touched her, promised her pleasure and power in exchange for her loyalty. She confesses to signing a book in blood, to flying through the air, to unspeakable things done under the full moon. The audience shifts. Some gasp, some avert their eyes. But you're frozen, because none of it sounds real. It sounds written, constructed, like a story built from pieces everyone already knows, like something pulled straight from the Malleus Maleficarum or whispered gossip after too much ale. And it is, because confessions like this were never clean, never voluntary, and almost never true. Most of them were carved out through torture, thumbs crushed, feet scorched, sleep stolen day after day until reality cracked, and the only way out was to say what they wanted. And what they wanted, more often than not, was something erotic. The inquisitors always circled back to sex. Who did you touch? Who touched you? What did it feel like? Did you like it? Did the devil kiss your thighs? Did you scream? These weren't questions about crime, they were fantasies dressed in robes. The confessions weren't evidence, they were theatre, a ritual of humiliation disguised as truth. Take this actual line from a 16th century trial record. She confessed that the devil came to her in the form of a beautiful man, that his embrace was cold as stone, yet her body did not resist him. That's not law, that's pulp fiction. And yet these confessions were used to justify burning someone alive. And here's where it gets even darker. Once a woman confessed to having sex with a demon, her body became evidence, literally. Inspectors, usually men, were authorised to search her for witch marks, moles, scars, skin tags, birthmarks. Any blemish could be interpreted as the devil's brand. And if she cried or screamed during the exam, that was taken as proof she was hiding something. If she didn't, then she was obviously possessed. So imagine standing there, stripped, touched by strangers, your skin treated like a crime scene, and no matter how you respond, it makes you guiltier. You glance back at the woman standing before the court. She's not crying now, just staring at the wall like she's somewhere far away. And maybe she is. Maybe she's remembering the herbs in her garden, the warmth of her cat curled by the fire, the last normal day before someone pointed and said her name. The judge asks if she has anything to say. She doesn't. Or maybe she knows it won't matter. Because in these trials, innocence was never the goal. Confession was, spectacle was, and humiliation, that was baked into the process. You think of another case, not this woman, but one from France, late 1400s, a widow, mid-40s, accused of causing a neighbour's impotence. He swore that, after refusing her romantic advances, he could no longer perform with his wife. She denied it, of course, but under torture, she admitted to stealing a piece of his clothing and burying it beneath a tree. That, she said, made his manhood wither. She said she regretted it, that her jealousy overtook her. She was hanged a week later. Was it true? Probably not. But it satisfied the narrative. It made his failure someone else's fault. And that's the pattern, again and again. These confessions sound theatrical because they are. They have rhythm, plot points, even arcs. First the seduction, then the pact, then the climax. Always literal, always described in way too much detail. And finally the regret. A neat little moral package. Sin, pleasure, consequence. The kind of story that fits comfortably in a sermon or a court record. There were some who objected, jurists and scholars who said confessions under torture were worthless, that they proved nothing except that pain makes people say anything. But those voices were drowned out, because these trials weren't about justice, they were about reassurance. Reassurance that evil had a face, that it could be named, chained and burned, that you could point to someone and say, there, that's the danger, not me, her. The clerk finishes reading. The judge nods solemnly. Sentence will be passed tomorrow, but the outcome's already written in the air. The woman is led away again, feet dragging, head bowed, and as the crowd disperses, no one speaks her name. You walk back into the rain, chilled by more than the wind. You think of all the women who were forced to become characters in someone else's nightmare, who confessed to fantasies not their own, who were punished for the same desire the judges denied by day and dreamed about at night. And you wonder what kind of world needs its courtroom confessions to read like erotica, just to feel safe. The fire is out now and the night is thick enough to chew. The moon hangs low, bloated and orange, like it's been watching something it can't unsee. You hear laughter, not the cheerful kind, but the kind that prickles the hairs on your neck. There's a group of people moving through the trees, their silhouettes flickering in and out of moonlight. You can't tell if they're real or just some trick of the shadows, but you follow anyway. Something pulls you forward, a drum beat maybe, or the promise of answers. Because tonight, you're going to the Sabbath. That word might sound harmless, like a lazy Saturday or a half-remembered holiday, but in medieval Europe, the Sabbath was the witch hunter's fever dream come to life. It was the imagined climax of all things heretical and sensual, a secret gathering of witches, demons and the devil himself, held at night in remote fields or mountain tops. And if the stories are to be believed, things got wild. You reach a clearing, real or imagined, and the scene unfolds like something from a heretical masquerade. Naked bodies, dancing in circles, fires crackling with greenish light, people smeared in ash or painted symbols, writhing, laughing, moaning. The devil, they say, appears in the form of a goat, or a handsome man, or sometimes a beast with no face at all. He receives their loyalty not through contracts, but through kisses, placed not on the hand, but on his unholy parts. Yes, really. That was a common detail. And here's the part that never seems to fade from the records, the orgies. According to inquisitors, the Sabbath wasn't just a political or spiritual rebellion. It was sexual chaos, total reversal of all Christian morality. Married people cheating, men with men, women with women, clergy members seduced by peasant girls. And at the centre of it all, witches, women mostly, allegedly leading the charge. Now let's get one thing straight. No historian believes the Sabbath was real, not in the way it was described. It was likely a mix of paranoia, distorted folklore and wild imagination. But that didn't stop people from believing in it, or burning people for it. The idea of the Sabbath was appealing because it offered a scapegoat for all the things society feared most. Lust, rebellion, pleasure, freedom. It was like a medieval horror movie blended with softcore porn and a sermon. All the things you weren't supposed to want rolled into one convenient nightmare. And the descriptions, way too detailed to be accidental. Inquisitors and clerics wrote about the Sabbath like frustrated playwrights. Women dancing naked with snakes, children sacrificed between bouts of lovemaking, demons teaching women how to seduce priests. Some even described witches rubbing flying ointments on their inner thighs and mounting broomsticks. Not to sweep floors, but to fly to the nearest dark forest in search of debauchery. Let's unpack that a little. The whole witches fly on broomsticks image has roots in these stories. Some scholars believe it started from the use of certain hallucinogenic plants, belladonna, henbane, mandrake, blended into a salve. When applied to mucous membranes, you know the ones, these substances could cause intense visions, euphoria, and the feeling of flying. So women applying flying ointment may have really experienced something otherworldly, at least internally, but once the Inquisitors heard about it, they turned it into something filthy and blasphemous. Flight became fornication, ecstasy became sin. And remember, these weren't underground pagan orgies. These were accusations, forced confessions, vivid reconstructions written by men trying to prove how far someone had fallen. Most of the accused had no idea what a Sabbath even was until someone told them, over and over in a locked room with no windows, what they had done. That's what's so disturbing. The Sabbath wasn't something you attended. It was something painted onto you. You think of Maria, a real woman accused in 1627 of travelling by night to a mountain gathering. She confessed to dancing around a fire while devils played pipes and other women moaned in the grass. The Inquisitors asked about the devil's kiss, the music, the wine, the touching. Her answers, doubtless extracted with pain, matched their script perfectly. Almost too perfectly, as if someone had rehearsed it for her. As if she'd finally given them what they wanted, so they'd stop pulling out her fingernails. There's even debate today among scholars. Was the Sabbath entirely invented, or was it a distorted echo of older pre-Christian fertility festivals? Some historians suggest the church co-opted and demonized ancient rites. Seasonal dances, moonlit rituals, village celebrations, turning them into devil-worshipping sex cults in their records. Others say that's romanticizing the past, that there was no tradition to reclaim, just fear twisted into fantasy by lonely monks with too much imagination and too little empathy. And that's the thing. The Sabbath says more about the people writing the accusations than it ever did about the accused. Their obsession with female bodies, with sex outside marriage, with imagined perversions. They turn those fixations into evidence, into spectacle, into truth. You look again at the clearing. The laughter's died down, the fires have dimmed, the bodies are gone, or maybe they were never there. Maybe it was all smoke and story, but the damage is real. Because once a community believes its nightmares are true, they don't need proof, just names. And the Sabbath gave them a story that explained everything they hated. Women who didn't submit, people who didn't marry, sex that didn't look the way they wanted it to. It let them say, look at what they do in secret, look at how evil they are. And then it let them kill those people without guilt. After all, they weren't executing a neighbour, they were destroying a monster. You walk back through the trees, the moon now half hidden behind clouds. You know the Sabbath probably never happened. Not like that. But in some twisted way, its legacy is realer than anything else tonight. Not because witches flew naked through the sky, but because people believed they did. And belief, when mixed with power, makes a very convincing fire. The town feels different in daylight, less haunted, more hushed. But there's something uneasy in the way people glance at one another, like they're always expecting a secret to slip out. You follow a narrow path to a low, mossy building on the edge of the village, where a line of women waits quietly outside. No one talks. They just shift their weight and avoid eye contact, like patients waiting for a grim diagnosis. You ask someone what they're here for, and she murmurs, "The search," then looks away. Inside, it smells of soap, old sweat, and scorched candle wax. The room is cold, bare, and lit by a single narrow window. A wooden table sits in the centre, covered in a grey sheet. Beside it, a man in a plain robe flips through a ledger, while a woman, older, sour-faced, arms crossed, watches with a grim sort of professionalism. She is the searcher, a midwife usually, or someone trained by one. But today she's not here to deliver babies. She's here to inspect bodies for signs of the devil. You step aside as the next woman is called in. She's young, trembling, eyes darting like a cornered rabbit. She's told to strip. Every layer removed is another nail in the coffin of dignity. The searcher circles her, peering at her skin for blemishes, moles, birthmarks, scars. Anything unusual, anything that might be declared a witch's mark. Here's how this worked back then. It was believed that when someone made a pact with the devil, he would leave a mark on their body, a symbol of ownership. Sometimes it was described as a red or black dot, other times as a hidden nipple or teat from which demons or imps could suck nourishment. Yes, seriously, they genuinely believed witches had secret extra nipples specifically for feeding demonic familiars. The imagination on these guys, honestly. And it wasn't just superstition. These so-called marks were treated as hard evidence in court. If you had one, you were presumed guilty. If the searcher pricked it with a needle, and you didn't bleed or cry out, that was more proof. Never mind that centuries of malnutrition and poor hygiene could leave you with numb spots or nerve damage. Or that a skin tag might be from genetics, not Satan. Rationality had no seat at this table. The woman on the table flinches as the searcher lifts her arm and examines the underside. Finds a freckle, a small mole. She frowns, nods to the scribe, and he writes something down. That's it. That's enough to raise suspicion. And suspicion in this world is the first domino. The cruelty of these searches wasn't just in the invasion of privacy, it was in the way they turned a woman's body into her enemy. Your skin was a traitor. Your flesh held secrets you didn't even know. Imagine growing up with a mole on your thigh, something you've had your whole life, and now it might be the reason you're arrested. It might be the last thing anyone ever looks at before you're sentenced to death. There are recorded cases where entire trials hinged on one blemish. In 1591, in Scotland, a woman named Agnes Sampson was accused of causing a nobleman's illness. Under torture, she confessed to witchcraft, and during her body search a mark was found on the place where no honest woman would show. She was executed, of course, but the language lingers. No honest woman, as if decency had a geography. And what's worse, sometimes the searchers were women themselves, not always by choice. Often they were appointed by male authorities to lend credibility to the process, as if the presence of another woman made it any less humiliating. But the truth is, many of these searchers were just trying to protect themselves, cooperate, or become a suspect. That was the game, and once you were in the game, there was no winning. You hear a soft sob as the young woman dresses again and walks quickly out the door. The next one is already stepping forward. No time to breathe, no room for mercy. This isn't justice, it's ritual, it's the slow grind of a machine that needs bodies to keep moving. One of the more fringe beliefs about these marks was that they could disappear at will. The devil, it was said, could hide them with magic. So if no marks were found, that didn't prove innocence. It proved the devil was covering his tracks. It's the ultimate catch-22. Have a mark? Guilty? Don't have one? Still guilty? Everything somehow loops back to guilt. Even the language used in these trials dripped with paranoia. The marks weren't just called blemishes. They were described as seals, brands, teats, blasphemies of the flesh. The skin, once thought to protect the soul, was now its greatest liability. And that idea wormed its way into every corner of the culture. Women began covering more skin, avoiding communal baths, praying for clear complexions, not out of vanity, but fear, because the wrong mark in the wrong place could mean death. You pause, staring at your own hands, your own arms. You think of every scar, every line, every spot you've never questioned before. In this world, any of them could have been enough. Any of them could have damned you, not because of what they were, but because of what someone decided they meant. Scholars today still argue over how much of this was sincere belief and how much was pure control. Was it a real religious panic or just a convenient excuse to police women's bodies? Probably both. The fear was real. So was the misogyny. They fed each other in a toxic loop. You leave the building as the door closes behind the next woman. The line hasn't gotten any shorter. The clouds overhead haven't moved. You feel something twist in your gut. Because even though these searches are long gone, the idea that your body can betray you, that's harder to shake. You're walking again through a part of the village no one talks about out loud. The lower courtyard behind the courthouse, shadowed and cold, where the stones are stained darker than they should be, and the air smells faintly of iron. There's a wooden door here, reinforced with rusted hinges, that leads down a narrow set of steps. And beneath it all, below the cobbles, below the noise, below the daylight, is the torture chamber. It's quiet. Always is. That's the worst part. Not the screaming, but the silence before it. This is where the questions get asked. Not the polite kind. Not the sort with parchment and pens. The other kind. The kind that comes with splinters, chains, and things that crank and stretch and tighten. The kind of questions that don't need answers, they just want pain. And the questions in witch trials always come back to the same subject. Sex. It's not subtle. Once a woman is accused, the interrogation almost always circles around her body. What she's done with it, what she's allowed, what's been done to her. Inquisitors want details. Did she lie with the devil? Did she take pleasure? Did he mark her, enter her, teach her things she couldn't possibly know? They don't just ask, they dig. And when she hesitates or when she screams, they take that as proof. A witch, after all, would resist confession. You look at the tools, the rack, the pear, the thumbscrews, each one has a purpose and none of them are quick. There's a chair with metal spikes. Not enough to kill, just enough to pierce skin, press into muscle, leave blood without mercy. And there, in the corner, a simple rope and pulley system. The strappado, arms tied behind the back, body hoisted into the air, then dropped just enough to dislocate the shoulders. Not a death sentence, just a little reminder that you're not in charge of your own limbs anymore. Now, picture a woman strapped into that chair. She's been here for hours, maybe days. No food, no sleep, no warmth. The Inquisitor leans close and begins his questions. Always about sex. Why? Because in their minds witchcraft is sexual. The pact with the devil is sealed with the body. The magic comes through desire. So to break her, they need to get into her flesh and rip the secrets out. She says nothing, at first. They always start with nothing. But silence becomes pain, and pain becomes story. She confesses, eventually. They all do. Maybe she says she laid with a demon. Maybe she says he came to her in a dream and made her feel things, strange, burning, blasphemous things. That's what they're waiting for. Once they hear it, they stop. She's done, and she's damned. There are real transcripts that read like nightmares. One woman in Würzburg was questioned for days about whether she took pleasure in Satan's embrace. That specific phrase was repeated 16 times in the documents. Not, did he visit you? Not, did you believe in him? But did you enjoy it? Because in these twisted trials, pleasure itself is the crime. And not just pleasure, female pleasure. The entire structure of witch interrogations was built on the assumption that women were uniquely vulnerable to desire. That they couldn't help but fall for Satan's charms, that their bodies were traitorous, easily swayed by sensation. So when a woman confesses to enjoying the devil's touch, that's not just sin, it's betrayal of divine order. It's the proof they need that she doesn't belong to God anymore. But here's the sickest part. A woman could be tortured into confessing to sexual acts that never happened, and they're banished for those acts. In other words, the torture invents the crime, and the crime justifies the torture. It's a closed loop, and there's no way out. Let's not pretend the Inquisitors were neutral parties. Many were obsessed with the erotic content of the confessions. They took notes in lurid detail. They asked for repeat descriptions. In one trial from the Higher Pyrenees, a woman was forced to explain exactly how the devil entered her, what he looked like, how he selled, what noises she made. The clerks copied it all and down carefully, like that they were scripting a scene instead of documenting a death. Scholars still debate how much of this was religious versus psychological. Were the Inquisitors truly convinced they were saving souls? Or were they just using their robes and titles to indulge some very dark fantasies? Maybe both. Either way, the women being tortured didn't care about the answer. They just wanted it to stop. And then there's the role of shame. Sexual torture wasn't always about the body. It was about breaking identity. A woman stripped, humiliated, forced to confess things that made her hate herself? She stops being a person. She becomes the image they've painted of her. A vessel, a whore, a witch. In one infamous trial in Württemberg, a woman was forced to confess that she taught other women how to seduce priests. She named names, hers, her sisters, her neighbours. Under the lash she told them whatever they wanted to hear. They executed her. Then they went after the women she mentioned. The cycle spun on, one confession birthing another, like a disease passed mouth to mouth. And the worst part, even when the torture ended, it never really stopped. The shame stuck. The words lived on in court records. The rumours lingered. Families were ruined. Children orphaned. Husbands left behind with a reputation they didn't ask for. All because someone dreamed up a confession with just enough heat to make it sound believable. You look again at the tools on the wall. They're clean now, unused, but you can still feel their weight in the room. Not in metal, but in memory. This wasn't justice. This wasn't even about crime. It was about control. about punishing women for wanting, for knowing, for existing in a way that made someone uncomfortable. And if that meant chaining them to a wall and forcing a story out of their mouths, so be it. You climb the stairs slowly, the light at the top feeling thin and distant. Your feet touch the cobblestones again, but you don't feel free. Not really. Because once you understand how pain was used to sculpt lies, it's hard to walk past a whisper without wondering what was behind it. There's a wedding happening near the chapel today. You can hear the bells pealing overhead, their bright clangs echoing off the stones like a forced smile. Flowers line the walkway, fresh pine branches crushed beneath the feet of the guests, their scent sweet and sharp. You see the bride young and pale, her veil trembling in the breeze. She's not crying, but she isn't smiling either. And when she glances at the groom, twice her age, thick-necked, red-faced, you see something flicker behind her eyes. Resignation, maybe calculation. You're not sure which is worse. That's how it went in most places. Marriage wasn't about love. It was about land, lineage, politics, or survival. A woman had little say in who she married, and less in what happened after. Her body, her labour, her voice all transferred to her husband the moment they left the altar. And if something broke down in that marriage, if the husband strayed or beat her or failed to provide, there was no easy way out. Divorce in most parts of medieval Europe was either illegal or nearly impossible, and legal separation required proof of something dire, abandonment, impotence, or abuse, and even then, the burden fell on the woman to prove it. But if she spoke up too loudly, if she demanded too much, if she simply tried to leave, well, then came the whispers that she was difficult, rebellious, unnatural, dangerous, and before long those whispers curled into something sharper. Witch. You start to see the pattern now. When a man failed his marriage, society looked the other way. Boys will be boys. But when a woman did, it wasn't just a failing, it was a threat, a disruption of the social order. So instead of sympathy, she got suspicion. Instead of freedom, she got fire. There are cases, hundreds actually, where women were accused of witchcraft shortly after disputes with their husbands or in-laws. Some tried to leave abusive marriages, some simply outlived their usefulness. A wife who couldn't bear children was a disappointment. A widow who inherited property was a liability, and either could easily become a target. One false rumour, one cold stare, one moment of defiance, and suddenly she's not a wife anymore. She's a witch. Take the case of Anna, a baker's wife in 16th century Nuremberg. Her husband accused her of adultery after he discovered she'd been meeting secretly with another man. Not for romance, but to hide money, her own dowry, which she feared he'd squander. When he brought her before the town elders, she denied the affair, but the man, terrified of what might happen to his own reputation, claimed she'd bewitched him into complicity. Within a month she was in chains. The trial focused not on her finances, but on her body, what she wore, how she spoke, whether her cooking made men feel strange, whether she walked alone at night. She was executed before year's end. It's an old truth dressed in old clothes. Sometimes it's easier to punish a woman than admit you were wrong about her. Even more disturbing is how the church positioned adultery alongside witchcraft. Both were betrayals, both were framed as moral collapses tied to female lust, and both could result in public penance, or worse, execution, depending on who told the story first. There's a known case in England where a man confessed to cheating on his wife, but claimed he couldn't help himself because she was cold and never looked him in the eyes. A few weeks later, she was accused of placing a spell on him to keep him away. She'd done nothing, but by then it didn't matter. She was already the type. The logic was cruelly convenient. If a man desired someone else, it wasn't his fault. His wife had failed him, or worse, enchanted him into dissatisfaction. And if a woman was unfaithful, she wasn't just immoral, she was unnatural. She'd stepped outside the bounds of expected behaviour, and what waited there was not freedom but fire. Let's talk about the unmarried too, the spinsters, the young women whose dowries never came through, the widows who refused to remarry. These women made people uncomfortable because they didn't fit the mould, they weren't controlled by a husband, and that made them suspect. Independent women were seen as either pathetic or predatory. Either you were a burden, or you were luring men with something unnatural. And that brings us to another terrifying legal twist. Once accused of witchcraft, a woman's marital status often worked against her. If she was married, the court might say she had corrupted her husband, ensnared him, emasculated him, turned him from God. If she was single, they'd say she was ungoverned, untethered, drifting, dangerous. In both cases, her sexuality was considered deviant, either too active or too absent. Either way, guilty. Here's a strange little cultural detail from the Dutch provinces. In some villages, women who were suspected of adultery were forced to walk barefoot through the town square, wearing only a shift while being pelted with spoiled fruit and mud. The community ritualized her humiliation, and even if she was later cleared, that stain stuck. Some of those same women were later accused of witchcraft, because once you've been humiliated publicly, people began to start believing you deserved it. The line between bad wife and witch was so thin you could trip over it in the dark. And sometimes it wasn't even about sex. Sometimes it was about money. Women who tried to keep their own inheritance, who disputed wills, who resisted being married off again. These were labelled as greedy, manipulative, unnatural. Witches, of course, because in a world where a woman's role was to be given, passed, traded and claimed, anyone who stepped out of that flow became a blockage, a threat, and society hates a clog in its pipe. You hear the wedding bells fall silent, finally. The bride and groom disappear inside the chapel for the rites. The guests drift toward the banquet tables. Laughter rises. You watch from the edge, thinking about how many marriages were really just contracts in a different font. How many women walk down that aisle towards someone who didn't want a partner, just property? And when property talks back, it burns. The feast after the wedding is loud, stuffed with salted meat, sour bread, and wine that tastes more like vinegar than celebration. You linger on the edge of it all, watching as people toast, sing, shout over each other. A group of older women sits near the fire, not quite included, not quite ignored. One of them wears a veil even indoors, not for modesty, but for mourning. She's a widow, still sharp-eyed, still proud. You can tell by the way people avoid looking her directly in the face. You've seen it before, the uneasy glance, the polite silence. She's outlived her husband, and in doing so crossed a line. Because in this world, women are sorted into two categories, pure or impure, virgins or witches, saints or seductresses. And once you're no longer protected by the innocence of youth or the authority of a husband, you slide, whether you like it or not, toward the wrong side of that divide, the grey space between woman and monster. It's no coincidence that the most venerated women in medieval Christianity were virgins, Mary, the ultimate holy woman, whose purity elevated her above the ordinary. She was praised not for what she did, but for what she didn't do. She didn't sin, didn't desire, didn't touch or get touched. She submitted, quietly, humbly, to God's plan. She was the mould, the ideal, and that mould crushed everything that didn't fit. A young woman who expressed her sexuality was dangerous. A married woman who enjoyed sex? Suspicious. But a widow who had once known sex and now controlled her own life? That was terrifying, because she couldn't be boxed in anymore. She had knowledge of the body of men of money. She didn't answer to a father or a husband, and for many that freedom looked a lot like defiance. It's in this cultural tension that the virgin versus witch archetype was born. One was light, the other shadow. One was elevated, the other degraded, and the line between them was razor thin. Even religious women weren't safe. Female saints were only accepted if they were sufficiently passive, martyrs who were tortured for their purity, or mystics who denied themselves food and sleep to prove their spiritual devotion. But if a woman claimed too much authority, if her visions were too powerful, too vivid, too sensual, she was questioned, accused, silenced. Consider St. Hildegard of Bingen, a nun, composer and mystic who wrote detailed accounts of her visions. She walked the line successfully but barely. Her work was accepted because it was tightly wrapped in theology, but many others weren't so lucky. Women who claimed divine insight were often accused of heresy or even witchcraft, especially if their revelations threatened church authority or involved, God forbid, anything bodily. The irony is suffocating. Purity was exalted, yet also impossible. A woman was expected to remain pure in a world that defined her body as impure from birth. Eve's sin, remember? It stuck. So even virgins weren't truly safe. Their virtue could be questioned at any time, especially if they resisted marriage too long or were found alone with the wrong person. All it took was one accusation, one outré rumour, one flash of jealousy from a neighbour, and suddenly the holy woman becomes the hunted one. There's a case from 15th century Austria that tells this tale perfectly. A young girl named Margarita was known for her piety. She fasted, prayed, claimed visions. People came to her for spiritual guidance, but she refused to marry, claimed she was promised to Christ. That was fine at first, novel even. But when a local priest began promoting her visions as divine, and her influence grew, that's when the other priests took notice. Her miracles were reclassified as lies, her trances, possession. Within a year, she was imprisoned. Her final confession, undoubtedly coerced, described dreams of carnal temptation and dancing with devils. She was never officially executed, but she vanished from the record after 1473, which back then basically meant the same thing. The same dynamic played out in art. Medieval paintings almost always portrayed women in extremes, either glowing with innocence or writhing in torment. The Virgin was painted with downcast eyes, her head bowed, hands folded. The witch, by contrast, was often depicted with wild hair, exposed breasts, and serpents coiling around her limbs. Two sides of the same coin. You're either sacred or sexual, never both. Certainly never neither. You walk the edge of the banquet, passing girls with the flushed cheeks and boys stealing glances. You wonder how many of them understand the tightrope they'll have to walk. How many will learn the hard way that virtue isn't a shield, it's a target, that no matter how good they are, they'll still be measured by the wrong things. How long their skirt is, how often they smile, whether they close their legs when they sit, whether their breasts move when they breathe. You pass a merchant talking about his daughter, bragging not about her wit or strength, but about how pure she is. Still untouched, he says, like she's a fruit. You feel something sour in your stomach, because you know that purity isn't really about virtue. It's about control, about ownership, about making sure a woman's body belongs to someone else, godfather, husband, anyone but her. And when she tries to claim it for herself, that's when the trouble starts. Even today, historians argue about the function of this purity-witch binary. Was it deliberate control or cultural reflex? Some suggest it was the Church's way of reinforcing obedience. Others say it was simply fear of female autonomy, of sexuality, of the unknown. But whatever the motive, the result was always the same. Women crushed beneath impossible expectations. If you were too pure, you were suspicious. If you weren't pure enough, you were damned. It was a no-win game. The wedding feast winds down. The bride and groom have disappeared into the house. Somewhere music plays, faint and off-key. You watch the widow with the veil rise and walk away alone, her back straight despite the stares. She is no longer a virgin, no longer a wife. She exists outside the framework now, and because of that she is feared. You follow slowly, quietly, wondering how many women have had to choose between being adored and being accused, between silence and survival, and how many were burned for refusing to play either role. You find yourself in a different part of the village tonight, farther from the chapel bells and the tidy rows of cottages. This street is narrower, less travelled, with shutters that stay closed long past sunrise, and houses that keep too many secrets. Here, people speak more softly, or not at all, because this is where the other outsiders live, the ones who don't marry, don't procreate, don't confess the right things at the right times, the ones whose very existence bends the rules of the world they've been forced to live in, the ones they call deviant, perverse, damned, and in the worst moments, witches. It's easy to forget, buried under centuries of ash and ash-thick theology, that medieval Europe didn't just fear women, it feared anyone who didn't fit the script. That meant healers, widows, heretics, Jews, and yes, queer people, people who loved the wrong gender, people who didn't conform to rigid gender roles, people who felt desire where desire wasn't supposed to go. These people were often lumped into the same category as witches, not because they cast spells, but because they broke the rules of bodies and behaviour. And in a society obsessed with order, that alone was enough. The Church considered sodomy a sin so grave it was placed on par with heresy, often higher. And like heresy, it was considered contagious, a rot in the moral fabric, something that could spread if not contained. So when witchcraft trials picked up steam in the 15th and 16th centuries, it's no surprise that accusations of same-sex acts often cropped up in the records, tangled up in the same breathless confessions as demon pacts and night flights. There's a case from southern France, late 1400s, where two women, Elisabetta and Jeanne, were accused of bewitching a married woman. The husband claimed his wife had grown unnaturally fond of Elisabetta, and that she refused to return to their bed. When questioned under threat of torture, the wife admitted to visiting the pair's cottage at night, to speak, to lie with them, to feel warmth and comfort. The interrogators seized on that last part. Warmth, comfort. Clearly she was bewitched. Her pleasure, non-heterosexual and unapproved, was interpreted as enchantment, not autonomy. The women were tried as witches. One confessed under pressure, the other did not survive the questioning. You walk past the house where the women once lived, though it's just a pile of stones now overgrown with moss, but you can still feel something there. Not ghosts exactly, just absence. A story erased because it didn't follow the rules. It wasn't just women. Men who loved other men were also dragged into witchcraft accusations. Not often, but often enough. The accusations weren't always explicit. They were coded, buried under layers of euphemism. Unclean companionship. Disordered brotherhood. Male enchantment. In one German case from the early 1600s, a schoolmaster was accused of both heresy and the unnatural touching of his students. He was later accused of flying through the air at night and consorting with a demon in male form. 2 charges, 1 body, same punishment. But the most insidious thing, most of these people weren't accused only because of their sexuality. It was always part of a larger narrative, a tapestry of suspicion. They were already strange, already isolated. Maybe they dressed differently, maybe they spoke too softly, maybe they didn't participate in feasts or didn't make eye contact, and that was enough. Difference in any form was treated as rot, and rot had to be cut out. You hear a door creak open somewhere behind you, then slam shut. Someone saw you standing there too long. Someone's wondering why you're asking questions. Because this part of history, it isn't just about women being targeted. It's about queerness being criminalised through association, through implication, through silence. There was no space for it to exist openly, so it festered in shadow. And those shadows became easy places to hang suspicion. The rhetoric was chillingly familiar. Just like witches were accused of luring the faithful away from God, queer people were said to lure others into sin. Just like witches were said to pleasure demons, queer people were accused of pursuing pleasure for its own sake, an unforgivable crime in a world where sex was supposed to be for procreation and little else. Just like witches were blamed for illness and drought, queer people were blamed for moral collapse. The language matched. The hatred rhymed. One of the most twisted parts of all this was how easily the church's war on sexuality folded into the witch trials. You weren't punished just for your actions, but for your desires, your dreams. If a man confessed under duress to dreaming about another man, that was evidence. If a woman confessed to finding comfort in the touch of a female friend, that was a warning sign. The inquisitors weren't just hunting witches, they were hunting any deviation from the sexual norm. And some did more than confess. Some, desperate for forgiveness or simply broken by isolation, turned themselves in. There's a record of a man in Florence who walked into a church and begged for confession. He admitted to thoughts, just thoughts, about other men. He was flogged publicly and exiled. Later, someone accused him of poisoning a neighbour's cow. The story evolved. Within a month, he was being tried for witchcraft. It wasn't about belief, it was about fear. And fear, once it gets its claws in something, doesn't let go. Historians today are only just beginning to untangle this part of the past. There are gaps in the record, deliberate ones. Queerness was so taboo that it was often left unspoken, which means many of those who are accused, punished, erased, aren't even remembered by name. They're just described, whispered about, folded into the margins of other people's stories. You stop in front of another ruined building, no plaque, no marker, just stone and shadow and time, and you realise that this entire village is built on the silence of people who were never allowed to be fully themselves, who were told that their love was poison, that their joy was evidence, that their existence had to be confessed away. You walk back into the main square, where the lights glow warm again, and no one says anything about the dark part of town. They never do, but the past lingers, thick as smoke, and if you listen closely you can still hear the echo of voices that were once called unnatural, or worse, called witches. You're standing on the steps of the courthouse again. The sun has returned, sharp and almost cruel in its clarity, like it wants to expose everything that's been hidden. Villagers bustle around the square. trading goods, shouting greetings, brushing crumbs from their cloaks. On the surface, it looks like any other day. But you've learned by now that nothing here is ever just what it looks like. Not the smiles, not the sermons, not the trials, and certainly not the men who run them. You watch a magistrate exit the stone building, robes flowing, like he's still pretending they weigh more than he does. His expression is solemn, but there's a glint behind his eyes that doesn't quite match the tone. The inquisitor beside him nods, murmuring something. They laugh. It's brief, but it curls your stomach. Because here's the thing no one likes to say out loud. The people conducting the witch trials, the judges, the priests, the scribes, were not neutral. They weren't above the fray. They were neck deep in it. And sometimes, beneath their holy books and official robes, they were just as lustful, corrupt, and power-hungry as the women they accused. Sometimes more. Records tell us about the accused, but every now and then, the curtain slips and we catch a glimpse of the accusers, their fixations, their contradictions, the quiet hypocrisies that seeped into every ruling. The men in charge were supposed to be paragons of virtue, defenders of the faith. But time and again, they couldn't seem to stop obsessing over the very sins they claimed to despise. Start with the questions they asked. Page after page of trial transcripts reveals the same pattern. A disturbing preoccupation with sexual detail. What did the devil look like? What did he do to you? Did you enjoy it? Not just once, repeated, probed, asked again in different wording. These weren't legal inquiries, they were voyeurism under the guise of sanctity. In one particularly infamous case in Trier, Germany, a woman named Margareta was accused after a local friar claimed she had seduced him in his dreams. He described at length her body, the way she appeared to him at night, the sounds she made. He claimed she had bewitched him, causing sinful visions and impure thoughts. But it doesn't take a scholar to see what was really happening. This wasn't evidence of witchcraft, it was projection. She was punished for being the object of a man's fantasies he refused to take responsibility for. You begin to see how power twisted everything. These judges and priests weren't just condemning witches, they were protecting themselves. By framing desire as attack, they could maintain the illusion of purity while indulging in an interrogation that bordered on fetish. It was a brilliant, horrifying sleight of hand. Make the accused a vessel of sin so you never have to look too closely at your own. And that's not even the worst of it. There are documented cases, many in fact, of inquisitors abusing their power for sex. Women accused of witchcraft were offered leniency in exchange for favours. Guards would visit cells at night. Trials would be delayed or dismissed if the accused were cooperative. Of course, none of this made it into the official records, but testimonies leaked out. Posthumous confessions, letters smuggled from dungeons, whispers in taverns. People knew. They just didn't say it out loud, because what would be the point? The same men judging you were the ones who wrote the rules. If you accused your accuser, you confirmed their story, that you were a liar, a seductress, a witch. Even the confessions, which were supposed to be sacred, were often rewritten, edited, embellished. There's evidence that scribes added phrases to make the accused sound guiltier, or sexier. One confession from northern Italy includes a passage where the accused allegedly moaned with delight as the devil kissed her breast. But handwriting analysis shows that section was written by a different scribe, in a different ink. It was added later, not for truth, for drama, for theatre. You sit on a bench in the square and watch a group of clerks pass by, their arms full of parchment. You wonder how many of those pages contain fiction. How many hold the words of broken women, twisted into something pornographic? How many were altered not because the truth was unclear, but because the truth wasn't interesting enough? Because that's what it became, didn't it? A performance. The accused were actresses in a play written by men who wanted both the thrill of sin and the satisfaction of moral superiority. They could leer and lecture in the same breath. They could punish what they themselves desired. And society let them. After all, these men were educated, cloaked in Latin and ceremony. Their authority was divine. Who would question them? Certainly not the peasants whose daughters had been taken. Not the wives afraid of becoming widows. Not the men eager to have their own guilt washed away by someone else's punishment. And that's the part that lingers long after the ashes settle. Not just that innocent people were killed, but that they were used, exploited, transformed into avatars for the fears and fantasies of the very people meant to protect them. There's a debate among historians today about how much of this was conscious. Were these men deliberately manipulating the system for pleasure and control, or were they true believers, victims of their own warped theology? Some argue that the lines between lust, guilt and piety were so tangled that even the inquisitors didn't know where one ended and the other began. Others say that's too generous. That power always knows what it's doing. Either way, the outcome was the same. Women burned, bodies broken, stories rewritten. You rise and walk through the square, past the gallows that now stands empty. The crowd has thinned, the bells are quiet, but that glint in the magistrate's eye, that doesn't go away. It's still there, hiding behind robes and rules and the illusion of virtue. And if you listen closely, you can still hear the echo of laughter that should never have been heard at all. You're up early the next morning, walking through a field rimmed with frost, your breath curling in the air like a slow ghost. A raven flies overhead, croaking out a single note. And for a moment, you expect the earth beneath your feet to open and swallow you whole. You've seen enough now to know the village's fears weren't about fire or potions or dark pacts. Not really. They were about the body, about who controlled it, about who was allowed to have power over anything at all, especially when that power lived in a woman's body. But here's a twist. Not all accused witches were women. You pass a wooden shed sagging under the weight of old snow and hear someone chopping wood behind it. A man, tall, weathered, face like old leather. He nods as you pass, but doesn't speak. You recognise him. He's the brother of a man accused years ago, not burned, not exiled, just shamed into silence. You wouldn't know unless you'd ask, unless you'd read the records. But the story is still there, tucked behind the frown lines and quiet mornings. Because yes, men were accused of witchcraft too. Not often, not publicly, but they were. It's one of the more overlooked pieces of the witch-hunting era, partly because the image of the witch is so deeply gendered. We imagine women, crones, seductresses, outcasts, but scattered across Europe from Norway to Naples, there are stories of men who are accused, tortured and sometimes killed for witchcraft. And when you dig into those stories, something curious happens. You see how differently their crimes were framed, how their trials were quieter, quicker, and often stripped of the erotic panic that clung to every accusation against women. The men accused of witchcraft tended to fall into certain categories. Healers, alchemists, herbalists, widowers, sometimes clergy, sometimes poor labourers with reputations for being unlucky or strange, and most importantly, often men who weren't quite manly enough. Too soft, too secretive, too separate. If a man lived alone or never married, or didn't fit the mould of hard-working, God-fearing masculinity, suspicion followed. There's a case from Sweden, early 17th century. A man named Lars was accused of casting spells on livestock. He was known for his knowledge of herbs, lived alone, and didn't attend church regularly. The villagers claimed his eyes shone red in moonlight, and that he spoke in languages no one understood. No mention of sex, no mention of seduction, just fear. He was flogged and forced into exile. He disappeared into the woods and was never seen again. Compare that to the women you've seen dragged through court whose bodies were inspected, whose sexuality was dissected like a frog on a table. Lars was a threat to the natural order. But women? Women were threats to the moral order, and that distinction mattered. A male witch was a curiosity, a female witch was a crisis. Even the language shifts when the accused is male. They're rarely called witches, more often sorcerers or cunning men. There's a faint air of respect, even fascination. Some men were rumoured to have learned their magic while travelling, studied in foreign lands, read forbidden books. Women didn't get that luxury. They weren't seen as scholars. If they had knowledge, it came from the devil. If they had influence, it was seduction. The male witch was mysterious. The female witch was dangerous. There's another layer to this, though, and it is where things get messier. Many male witches were accused of feminine magic, meaning they were charged with using charms and potions, particularly ones related to love, fertility, or healing, which, in medieval logic, made them even more suspect. Because they were stepping into women's territory, they were becoming like women. And being like a woman, in a system built on male dominance, was basically its own form of heresy. You start to see the unspoken truth. It wasn't just witchcraft that was punished, it was gender non-conformity. Men who acted like women were witches. Women who acted like men were witches. Anyone who slipped out of their expected shape, who made the culture squirm, got pushed toward the fire. There's a story from the Basque region of Spain where a man named Ignacio was accused of transforming into a goat at night and consorting with female witches. The details read like something out of a tavern tale. Rampant debauchery, flying feasts, satanic dances. But the underlying fear wasn't about magic, it was about masculinity. Ignacio was poor, unmarried, and didn't attend mass. He wept during interrogation. That detail was noted, highlighted even. The court used it as evidence of weakness, of duplicity, of something unmanly. He was accused not just of sorcery, but of being soft, of not being what a man should be. And if you look close, you start to see the same sexual panic that haunted the women's trials, but inverted. Male witches were often accused of being passive, of submitting to demons, of being used. And that, in a deeply patriarchal world, was horrifying, because passivity was a woman's domain, and for a man to cross that line was to threaten the entire hierarchy. Historians still argue about why male witches weren't treated with the same theatricality. Some say it's because male bodies weren't sexualized in the same way. Others suggest it's because men held more social power and could negotiate their way out of punishment more easily. There's probably truth in both, but the core idea remains. Witchcraft, at its heart, wasn't just about spells. It was about social control, and that control had very specific ideas about what men and women should be. You return to the main road and see the man still chopping wood. You think about how close his brother came to losing everything, about how his body wasn't searched, about how his thoughts weren't probed for lust. He was punished, yes, but not dismantled, not destroyed. And you realise again that the witch trials were never fair, not even in their cruelty, even in their violence. They played favourites, because when power fears you, it doesn't always burn you. Sometimes it just buries you. You walk deeper into the woods this time, away from the village, away from the bell towers and stone crosses and dripping eaves. The path narrows, softens, becomes less a trail and more a suggestion. The trees close in around you, old and gnarled, their trunks wrapped in ivy, their branches creaking like they remember everything that's ever happened here. And then, as the forest clears slightly, you see her. Not a person exactly, an image, a memory, a figure etched into folklore, older than the church, older than Latin, older even than the word witch. She doesn't wear a pointed hat, she's barefoot, hair loose and wild, skin streaked with earth. She carries a satchel of herbs, or maybe bones. She sings when she walks, but only to herself. They call her the Wild Woman. You've heard about her in whispers and bedtime tales. The witch of the woods, the woman who lives alone, who answers to no one. She might offer healing or mischief or a curse depending on her mood. She lives outside the law, outside the village, and she's free, which is why they fear her so much. Before Christianity, before Europe was crisscrossed with cathedrals and sermons, there were goddesses, nature spirits, forest mothers, women who were worshipped not for their chastity, but for their fertility, their wisdom, their connection to the land. These figures, Artemis, Diana, Hecate, the Morrigan, were powerful, untamed, and sometimes terrifying. But they were never ashamed, and as Christianity swept through, it didn't erase them, it just changed their names. The forest goddess became the witch, the sacred grove became the haunted wood, the healing woman became the hag. That's the thread historians keep tugging on, that maybe the image of the witch, the one we know, the one we burn, was born not from evil, but from older forms of reverence. That these so-called witches were simply the last echoes of paganism, of female autonomy, of lives lived outside the rigid lines drawn by men in churches and courts. You crouch near a stream and dip your fingers in the cold water. It's still, clean. You imagine the wild woman washing her herbs here, or her hands after childbirth. Not because she's hiding, but because this is where she belongs. She doesn't need permission to be here. She doesn't ask for forgiveness. She just is. This, of course, was part of the problem. The wild woman defies structure. She doesn't marry, doesn't confess, doesn't sit quietly in a pew or cross herself before meals. She follows the cycles of the moon, not the church calendar. And in doing so, she disrupts the very order the village depends on. She reminds them that not everyone needs a priest. Not everyone needs a man. Not everyone fears the dark. That kind of freedom is dangerous. So when crops fail, or children sicken, or animals die, and the villagers go looking for someone to blame, they remember the wild woman. The one who lives at the edge of the forest, the one who doesn't attend mass, the one who knows which mushrooms make you sleep and which make you see stars. They say she rides wolves, they say she drinks moonlight. They say she dances naked with the devil, but she doesn't need the devil. That's the part they don't understand. She was powerful long before anyone invented horns and pitchforks. There's a fringe theory among scholars that some witch accusations, particularly in rural regions, were remnants of pre-Christian rivalries, that women who kept older traditions, midwifery, herbalism, seasonal rites, were targeted not because they were dangerous, but because they refused to assimilate. They carried stories older than the Bible, and that alone made them subversive, threatening, and ripe for condemnation. In one village in the Black Forest, a woman named Elsa was accused after she performed a harvest blessing using a bundle of wheat, salt, and river stones. She claimed it was an old family ritual. The local priest called it pagan nonsense and demanded she stop. When the next season's yield was poor, the villagers blamed her, said she had cursed the land. Her knowledge of the old ways became evidence. Her silence became guilt. She was hanged before winter. Else wasn't alone. All across Europe, especially in regions slower to Christianize, you find stories of women like her, keepers of forgotten rites. The old religion didn't vanish, it just went underground, and the women who carried it, knowingly or not, became scapegoats when the world shifted. You reach a glade now, bathed in golden light, and sit against the roots of a tree older than memory. Here, it's easy to believe the stories weren't all lies. That once, women danced here without fear. That they healed and sang and made offerings to something that didn't need guilt to feel sacred. But you also know how that story ends. The wild woman doesn't last. She's hunted. Her songs are called spells. Her herbs become poison. Her solitude becomes evidence of sin. And the forest... Once a sanctuary becomes a trap, because no one is allowed to be wild forever. Not if they're a woman. Still, the image survives. In tales, in paintings, in every girl who runs into the woods to scream, in every woman who keeps a garden no one else understands, in every silence that says, "I do not belong to you." You rise, brushing leaves from your clothes. The forest watches you go, unbothered. It's seen worse, it'll see worse again. And somewhere between the village and the trees, the wild woman waits, not for redemption, not for resurrection, just to be remembered for what she really was, not a witch, not a demon, just free. The sky turns heavy by afternoon, churning with bruised clouds and the kind of quiet that precedes a storm. The villagers move faster now, glancing up as they hurry to tie shutters, bring in goats, and pretend the wind isn't whispering names. You wander to the edge of the meadow where the ground sags into a marsh. It smells like wet moss and old bones. People don't come here much. Too soft underfoot. Too many stories about what lives in the reeds. Or used to. They say this place belonged to wolves once, and maybe it still does. But in the years of peak witchcraft panic, something else haunted the bogs and hollows of Europe. Fear not just of witches, but of those who could shift, howl, and devour. Yes, we're talking werewolves, and yes, weirdly, they have everything to do with sex, sin, and the witch trials. It's easy to think of werewolves as a separate myth. Lurid, hairy, more horror film than historical document. But in late medieval and early modern Europe, the line between witchcraft and shape-shifting was paper thin. The same anxieties that fueled fear of witches about bodies, desires, unnatural appetites also fueled accusations of lycanthropy. And while most werewolves accused were men, the overlap with witchcraft made sure women weren't left out of the carnivorous fun. Start with the basics. The werewolf was a symbol of uncontrolled lust. Not just in the literal sense, like tearing flesh, but in a more Freudian, layered way. He was the man who couldn't keep himself civilized, who gave in to instinct, to hunger, to the animal within. And because Europe was a place obsessed with restraint, especially sexual restraint, nothing was scarier than the person who abandoned it completely. You might be thinking, okay, but wasn't that more of a dude problem? Fair. Most werewolf stories focus on men, hunters, soldiers, hermits, going feral under a full moon. But during the height of witch panic, that narrative started shifting. Suddenly, witches weren't just dancing with devils or whispering curses. They were transforming into cats, crows, goats, and yes, sometimes wolves. You can see this shift in the records. In a trial from Estonia in the 1600s, a woman named Lene was accused not only of hexing cattle, but of riding as a wolf through the woods with the devil's hounds. Witnesses claimed to have seen her sprinting on all fours. Her confession, as always tortured out of her, described a Sabbath where she and other witches drank from a black river and took on the form of beasts to hunt children. Wild, absolutely. Believed? Totally. These hybrid stories didn't emerge from nowhere. They echoed older pagan beliefs about shapeshifting, where certain women, often priestesses or nature spirits, could become animals as a form of power, not punishment. But in Christian Europe, transformation wasn't liberation. It was sin. It was surrender to base impulses, to lust, to the body. So if a woman was accused of becoming a wolf, she wasn't just a danger to the village, she was a woman who had lost her soul. Here's where it gets darker. Some of the most grotesque witch trials involved accusations of bestiality, and not just with animals, with demons in animal form, or the accused becoming animals during sexual acts. The language is vile, the descriptions are graphic, but the pattern is telling. These trials weren't just about stopping magic. They were about punishing desire that didn't follow rules. That felt wrong, that blurred lines. In one German case, a midwife was accused of birthing wolf children after sleeping with a demon in the form of a hound. Her body was examined, prodded, and declared marked by unnatural use, which, if you're wondering, is not something any doctor ever wants to write down. And if you're thinking, okay, but surely people didn't believe this literally, think again. Some really did. Others didn't care. Because whether or not a woman actually turned into a wolf didn't matter. The metaphor did. The idea that a woman could become wild, untamed, ruled by hunger. That was the true crime. Now here's a fringe detail you won't find in most textbooks. There were rumours that witches could create wolf belts, strips of enchanted animal hide that, when worn, allowed transformation into beasts. These were said to be rubbed with flying ointment, tied with human hair, and activated by moonlight and nakedness. Most of this comes from second-hand confessions, half remembered, half coerced, but the image stuck. A naked woman cloaked in fur sprinting through the woods under a silver moon. It wasn't just frightening, it was erotic, and that made it even more threatening. Because at the core of it all, the werewolf-witch crossover was about control. The body out of control, desire out of control, nature out of control. A woman who could turn into something else, something fast, something fanged, something dangerous, couldn't be managed, couldn't be owned. And so these stories were written backwards. Women weren't punished because they were animals. They were called animals because they were being punished. Think about it. If you were accused of witchcraft and confessed to flying through the night sky, you were executed. But if you said you flew as a wolf, that added a whole new layer of monstrosity. You weren't just rebelling against God, you were rebelling against being human. And nothing unnerved the powers that be more than a woman who refused to stay in the shape they gave her. You sit on a mossy log now, staring into the trees, listening for howls you know won't come, but the fear still hangs in the air. The fear of the woman who runs when she's told to kneel, the woman who bites when she's told to be quiet, the woman who sheds her skin and never asks for it back. The storm breaks finally, soft and slow. Rain patters the leaves like whispered names. And as you walk back toward the village, you wonder how many women they called wolves just because they didn't want to be lambs. By the time you reach the outskirts of the village again, the rain has stopped, leaving everything slick and humming with steam. The roofs glisten, the stones sweat, and the people, well, they pretend the storm never happened. That's their way. Keep your head down, keep walking. Don't ask questions about where the lightning struck or what smouldered beneath it. But today you're not here for the whispers or the witches, you're here for the books. Duck into a small lopsided building near the chapel, the scribe's hut. It smells like old ink, wax, and the kind of dust that's heavy with stories. A clerk sits inside, scratching notes into a parchment so worn you can see the indentations of earlier pages. He doesn't look up when you enter. He's used to people ignoring him, which is ironic, because this is the man who writes everything down. The trials, the confessions, the punishments. He's the quiet hand behind the spectacle. And what he records becomes the truth, or at least the only version of it that survives. This is where we start peeling back the final, most delicate layer of the witchcraft panic. The construction of narrative. How stories about sex, about sin, about power get written, rewritten, and preserved. How history itself gets bewitched. Most of what we know about witch trials comes from documents like the ones this clerk is copying. Trial transcripts, inquisitor manuals, court records. But these weren't neutral accounts. They were shaped by the biases of the people who created them. That means every line, every confession, every lurid description of night flights and demonic intercourse, those all pass through the filter of male, often clerical imagination. Take, for example, the notorious Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches, written in 1487 by Heinrich Kramer, a German inquisitor with the charm of a rusted bear trap. It's a thick, venomous text that reads like a combination witch hunting guide and medieval sex manual. And it was wildly influential. For centuries it shaped how Europe viewed witches, and especially how it linked female sexuality to devil worship. Kramer had a particular obsession with the idea that women were more likely to be witches because they were weaker in faith and more carnal by nature. He wrote that women were deceptive, insatiable, and easily led astray by their desires. In other words, the devil didn't need to work hard. Just show up in the form of a handsome man or a sensual dream, and women would practically beg to join him. That's the core of Kramer's argument. That female desire itself was unnatural. That a woman who took pleasure in her own body, or in anyone else's, was already halfway to damnation. The rest was just paperwork. You watch the clerk dip his pen again, careful, precise. Maybe he's copying a confession. Maybe he's rewriting one, because that happened too. Testimonies were often cleaned up before being entered into official record. Gaps were filled in, doubts erased. If a woman didn't confess the right things under torture, they sometimes wrote as if she had. Or they edited her words into a narrative that made more sense to the church. That sounded more sinful, more juicy. Because let's be honest, there was something theatrical about all of this. The confessions weren't just evidence, they were stories. Morality plays dressed in agony and ash. And they followed a script. Act 1. The woman is strange. Maybe she lives alone, maybe she's mouthy, maybe she just knows when a storm is coming before anyone else does. Act 2. Someone suffers, a cow dies, a baby gets sick, a man loses interest in his wife, and the village needs an explanation. Act 3. The woman is accused, brought in, searched, interrogated. Act 4. The confession. Always a performance, whether forced or faked. The devil came to her, he kissed her, touched her, slept with her, promised her power, she agreed. She danced, she flew, she fed her familiars from secret teats. She met with other women and did unspeakable things. Act 5. Execution, fire, if it's a big enough town, hanging if they're feeling frugal. And then, the final act, the record. Written down, filed away, turned into truth. And that's the part no one wants to talk about. That most of what we know about these women comes from men who hated, feared or lusted after them. That the surviving documents are laced with invention. And that even now, centuries later, when we try to tell their stories, we're still working with corrupted scripts. You pick up one of the clerk's discarded pages. It's a fragment of a confession. I lay with the devil. He was cold and smelled of ash. He entered me and I did not resist. You pause. The words are neat. Suspiciously neat. You've read enough by now to know what a real confession looks like. How messy it is. How broken. This one reads more like a sermon, or worse, a fantasy. You look at the clerk. He shrugs. I write what I'm told, he says. And that's the truth of it, isn't it? History, especially the history of women and their bodies, was written by people who were rarely interested in truth. They were interested in power, theology, in control, and they used the written word the same way they used fire. To purify what they didn't understand, to erase what made them uncomfortable, to scorch memory into obedience. There's a debate among scholars today. How much can we trust these records? Some argue that we must read them sideways, looking for the gaps, the contradictions, the silences. Others say that trying to extract the truth from them is like trying to reconstruct a voice from an echo. You'll get something, but not the original. And yet we keep reading, because in between the lies there are glimmers, real names, real moments, real pain, and maybe, just maybe, a whisper of the woman underneath the ink. You hand the page back and step outside. The rain has returned, soft now, almost apologetic, and you realise that everything you've seen, every accusation, every confession, every execution, wasn't just about witches, it was about the stories people chose to tell, and who they silenced to tell them. Because the most dangerous thing a woman could be, in this world, wasn't wicked. It was unrecorded. You step into the graveyard as twilight settles in, the kind of cold dimness that wraps around your ankles like fog. The stones are crooked here, tilted by centuries of frost and forgotten names. Some are marked with carvings still legible, Crosses, family crests, Latin prayers. Others are blank, weathered to smoothness, or broken entirely. A few have symbols that don't look like Christian iconography at all. Circles, spirals, curious sigils. You pause beside one that's half buried in earth, only the tip of a name still visible. You don't know who she was, but you can guess how she died, because not everyone who was accused of witchcraft made it to a trial. Some disappeared before their name was ever written down, vanished during the night, tossed into rivers, buried in unmarked graves at the edge of consecrated ground, close enough to pretend it counted, far enough that no priest would ever bless it. And this is where the forgotten ones lie. The accused who were never even afforded a final story. That's the part people forget. The mass of the dead doesn't come from the theatrical trials we read about in history books. It comes from the quiet erasures, the women no one bothered to defend, the men who weren't missed, the bodies buried without ceremony because no one wanted to admit they'd gone too far. You walk past one grave that looks newer than the rest, though it's still centuries old. A local legend says it belongs to a healer named Tilda. Never officially tried, never executed. She just vanished after the baker's baby died, and the midwife whispered that Tilda had cursed the milk. Her cottage was burned the next night. Her body was found days later, half-eaten by animals, but no one investigated. Instead, they buried her just outside the fence and sealed the story behind a muttered warning. Don't go into the woods alone. The real terror of the witch trials wasn't always the bonfires and the racks. Sometimes it was the silence, the casual nature of the violence. A neighbour could point a finger and destroy a life with nothing but a frown and a muttered complaint. The machinery of punishment was so well oiled, so deeply embedded in belief, that it didn't even need gears anymore. Just friction, just pressure, just fear. That's the word that hangs over these graves, fear. It governed everything. The fear of illness, of famine, of infertility, of women who knew too much, of men who desired too differently, of dreams that didn't match doctrine. And instead of confronting that fear, naming it, understanding it, people turned it into firewood. They fed it victims, and the more they burned, the safer they felt. Except, of course, they never really were. You crouch near another stone and run your fingers over the moss-covered engraving. It's faint, but you catch a name. Agatha. No date. No epitaph. Just that one word barely there. And yet she survived longer than most, if not in flesh then in stone. Here's something strange. In parts of Germany and Switzerland, folk legends developed around the graves of witches. People started leaving offerings, flowers, coins, even food. Not out of reverence necessarily, but fear. The belief was that these women might still hold power even in death, that their spirits could bring protection or revenge. It's paradoxical, they were called evil, condemned, executed, and then quietly venerated when no one was watching. One particularly eerie story comes from a village near Lake Geneva, where the grave of a woman named Sabine became a pilgrimage site for unwed mothers. They'd leave herbs and pieces of cloth on her tombstone, asking her to watch over them during childbirth. Sabine had been a midwife, accused of sorcery after 3 stillbirths in a row. No trial, just a mob and a shallow grave. But the legend outlasted the verdict. In death she became something else, a saint without approval. It's these contradictions that tell the real story, that while the institutions tried to define witches as evil, filthy, perverse, inhuman, the people on the ground knew better, or at least suspected. They saw the same woman who helped deliver their children dragged away in chains. They heard the same girl who braided their daughter's hair accused of dancing with devils, and part of them had to wonder, if she's a monster, what does that make me? And yet no one spoke up, or not loudly enough, because fear is a stronger currency than truth, and it buys silence in bulk. You sit down now, beside the gravestone with Agatha's name. The sky above is streaked with violet. The village lights blink on in the distance one by one like cautious eyes, and you wonder, what would these women say if they could rise? Not as vengeful ghosts, but just as themselves, as people. Maybe they'd tell you their real stories, the ones behind the confessions, that they never flew, that they never danced with demons, that the ointments they made were for arthritis, not astral projection, that they knew the herbs because their mothers had taught them, that they touched another woman not because the devil commanded it, but because it felt like comfort in a world that offered none. Or maybe they wouldn't say anything. Maybe they're tired of explaining, of justifying, of being turned into metaphors for everything men don't understand. There's a scholarly debate, always is, about how we should remember the witch trials. Should we focus on the theological context, the political motivations, the sociology of mob behaviour? But others argue that what matters most is simply mourning, not analysing, not dissecting, just acknowledging the loss, the sheer staggering scale of it. Tens of thousands of people, burned, hanged, drowned, tortured, silenced. Their stories twisted into sermons or forgotten entirely. And for what? For making someone uncomfortable, for bleeding the wrong way, for dreaming out loud. You stand, brushing earth from your hands. The names may be fading, but they're not gone. Not yet. As long as someone reads them, someone remembers, the story stays alive. And maybe that's the most radical thing we can do. Not let them vanish. Because the true curse wasn't witchcraft. It was forgetting. You wake in the middle of the night, drawn outside by a sound you can't quite place. Not footsteps, not voices. Just the hush of leaves stirring, wind brushing against rooftops, the occasional creak of timber settling into itself. The village is asleep, its fires reduced to ember glows behind shuttered windows. And yet something feels awake, alert, watching. You walk barefoot through the square, the cobblestones still warm from the day's sun. You pass the old stocks, the church door, the well where secrets used to be whispered before they were shouted in courtrooms. But tonight, you're headed toward a place you haven't visited yet. A room above the scribe's hut, tucked into the back of the chapel wall. They call it the archive. It's not on any tour, not listed on any map, but it's there. You find the entrance behind a tapestry, pull the cord and climb narrow wooden stairs so worn in the centre you could skate down them if you weren't careful. At the top, a door locked, but not to you. It groans open, as if it's just been waiting for someone to care. Inside you find shelves, dozens, some sagging, some bowed like they're tired of holding what they've seen. Boxes, scrolls, leather-bound volumes, and piles of yellowed pages stacked like offerings. You run your fingers along a row of spines. Most are unlabelled. Some bear Latin phrases scrawled in shaking ink. De confessione, inquisitio prima Deus vult, God wills it. You open one. It's a confession. A woman named Clara. You recognise the script. It's that same too neat hand, the one that showed up in the other records. She says she slept with a demon in the form of a red-eyed man. She says he took her in the woods. She says she flew. She says she liked it. You close the book, not because you're scandalised, but because you know she didn't say any of that. Not really. Someone else said it for her. Wrote it. Performed it. Just like they always did. And here it sits, centuries later, waiting to be read like a ghost who's forgotten she's dead. You open another. This one is different. It's not a confession, it's a letter. From a woman named Beatrix, addressed to her daughter. I will not be coming home, it reads, but do not believe what they say. I only touched the plants, I only helped with the birth, I only lit candles, I never danced, I never flew, I never called him. If you hear them say otherwise, know they're telling you their story, not mine. You read it twice, then again. There are more like it, tucked into the margins of court records or slipped between pages. Notes written in haste, in code, in the desperate looping hands of people who knew they were losing control of the story. Some plead for justice, others simply ask not to be forgotten, and some, like Beatrix, know they won't be believed and write anyway. This is the part of the witch trials no one teaches you about. The resistance, the quiet refusal, the women and men who even under torture refused to give the inquisitors what they wanted, who bit their tongues bloody rather than describe an encounter that never happened, who died rather than lie, and those who somehow found ways to leave behind the truth in scraps and scribbles. You turn the page of another letter and find a list. Ingredients, not for spells, nothing glamorous. Just a recipe for a healing salve. Lavender, beeswax, pine resin, salt. A note beside it says, for bruises, rub gently, say nothing. You realise this was medicine, a midwife's formula. Someone tried to destroy it, but they didn't get them all. You keep reading, hours pass. You read about Isolde, who refused to confess anything except love for her children. About Thomas, accused of sorcery because he knew too much geometry and didn't laugh at the priest's jokes. About Helena, who was asked 16 times if she felt pleasure with the devil and replied, I felt cold. About Bruna, who told her interrogators they would not burn her because they already had and that her fire had just moved to another place. This archive isn't a relic, it's a battlefield. A record not of witches, but of the people they tried to unmake. a graveyard for truths that were rewritten, and a place somehow still standing where you can read what they weren't supposed to leave behind. There's a theory whispered among archivists and folklorists that the real legacy of the witch trials isn't the burnings, it's the rewriting of history, that the trials were as much about erasing alternative knowledge as they were about punishing it. That medicine, midwifery, fertility practices, early science, even forms of local governance, all of it was lost not to fire, but to shame. It's not just the people who were buried, it's the wisdom. And you wonder, how different would things look if these records weren't hidden? If we taught school children about Clara and Beatrix and Thomas and Helena, the way we teach them about kings and crusades, if we let their stories be what they were, not fairy tales, not fables, but evidence. The hour is late now, the windows are black. You tuck a folded page back into its book and replace it on the shelf, careful not to let the spine split. You walk down the stairs slower this time, listening to each creak. Each one sounds like a voice, like someone stepping beside you. Maybe they are. Back in the square, everything is still. The moon slips between clouds. The church bell stays quiet. You stand alone, holding the weight of hundreds of voices who were once stripped of their own. But not anymore. Not tonight. Dawn arrives slowly, bleeding gold and grey across the rooftops, the mist lifting like breath from the earth. The village begins to stir. Doors creak open. Pails scrape against wells. A rooster with a death wish declares the day with obnoxious certainty. You've been up all night, but the tired hasn't set in, not really, because something shifted in that archive, in you. It's not just a story anymore, it's personal, and as the sunlight pushes shadows out of the corners, you take one last walk through the village, past the chapel, the square, the graveyard. You notice things you didn't before, a charm hanging from a doorway, a bundle of rosemary tied to a post, a circle drawn faintly into the dirt with a heel or a stick, wards, leftovers, or maybe just memories etched in muscle memory. Not superstition exactly, not magic, just survival in the form of habit. You reach the edge of the village, where the land rolls into fields and the air smells of grain, and you realise it never really stopped. The fear, the rules, the control. We don't burn witches anymore, sure, but we still punish the wrong kind of woman. We still police bodies, still twist stories to fit the shape that power prefers. The tools are different now, but the hands? Same old knuckles, same old grip. Even today, when people talk about the witch trials, they say things like mass hysteria or primitive superstition. They distance themselves as if we've evolved past that kind of thing. But the truth is, what happened here wasn't about belief in magic. It was about belief in control and the fear of losing it. Because when you boil it all down, the flying, the sex with demons, the night dances, the animal transformations, it's all just metaphor for people refusing to behave, for women choosing something other than obedience, for bodies acting on their own terms, for knowledge that didn't come stamped with approval. The witch was never the villain. She was just the one who didn't kneel. And that's why they built the pyres. You pause at the fence line, fingers curled over the wood. A small girl stands nearby, braiding grass into little ropes. She hums to herself, off-key and wild, like she doesn't care if anyone listens. You ask her what she's making, and she shrugs. Witch ropes, she says, casual as anything. Why? To keep the cows calm. My grandmother taught me. You smile and ask if her grandmother was a witch. No, she says, but she knew things. You nod. That's how it always starts, doesn't it? She offers you one of the little ropes, and you tie it around your wrist without thinking. It smells like earth, like summer, like something older than doctrine. Behind you, the village continues its rituals. Morning bread baking, tools sharpened, water hauled, life carrying on as it always has, shaped by hands that remember what happened, even if the mouths that own them don't say it aloud. That's the legacy of the trials, not just death, but the silence that followed. The way entire generations learned to shut up, look down, behave. But they didn't forget. Not really. And if you listen closely, beneath the churn of modern life, beneath the asphalt and the algorithms and the Sunday brunches, you can still hear her. The witch. The woman who lived in her body, the healer who knew too much, the girl who wouldn't say sorry. She hums through the cracks in the sidewalk, she dances behind closed doors. She brews tea that doesn't come in bags and sings to plants just in case. She's not gone. Just renamed, just rewritten. Because this story isn't over, and never was. Historians today still debate the true scale of the witch trials. Some say 40,000 died, others push the number higher. But the number almost doesn't matter anymore, because each one was a person, a mother, a daughter, a midwife, a weaver, a lover, a stranger, a spark. And each one left something behind, whether they meant to or not. Some left letters, some left curses, some left stories that took 500 years to find the right readers, and some, like you now, leave with eyes wide open. The girl with the grass rope skips away, leaving behind the hush of her tune. You start walking too, the field opening in front of you, wind stirring your hair like a whisper. Somewhere behind you, a bell rings. Not for a sermon, not for a trial, just the hour. And somewhere far ahead, maybe in another village, another century, someone will ask again, why were so many women burned? And someone like you will answer, because they dared to be whole. You leave the village behind, its steeples and smokestacks shrinking into the horizon as the path pulls you onward. The morning light has softened now, spilling through the trees like melted gold, warming your shoulders as you walk, and it's quiet. Not just the absence of noise, but that rare, full quiet that only comes after a story has finished saying what it needed to say. You exhale. Not relief exactly, something heavier, something more honest. What started as curiosity, just a nighttime journey into why sex was linked to witchcraft, became something deeper. You've walked beside the accused, read the false confessions, stood in fields where people once begged to be believed. And what's left isn't just shock or sorrow, it's clarity, a deeper understanding of what fear can do when dressed in righteousness, of what power looks like when it's terrified of losing control. Because at the heart of it, this wasn't just about witches, it was about bodies, about agency, about knowledge that didn't come from books or pulpits, about people, mostly women, often queer, sometimes simply poor, who refused to be erased quietly. And that refusal cost them everything. But not forever. They're still here, in fragments and echoes, in garden herbs and whispered songs, in the way we speak up, push back, tell the truth even when it's hard. Every time we question a rule, honour a different kind of knowing, or claim joy without asking for permission, we call them back. And maybe that's the real magic. So if you're lying in bed now, the glow of your screen fading, the hum of a fan soft in the background, just take a second, remember Clara, Beatrix, Helena, Thomas, the ones whose names you learned, and all the ones you didn't. Then breathe, deep and slow. Let your body soften, and know that you too are part of the spell they were never able to break.